Chapter 337. Chu Yang urged his horse to gallop as soon as he left the city gate. He looked like a cloud of dust as he swept across the ground. He would turn around and shout every once in a while, "Keep up! Quickly keep up!" It was as if he would not give up until the horse under him was completely exhausted. He kept urging the command horse rider to keep up. He wanted to let the command horse rider know that this matter was extremely urgent. The king-level expert must have obtained some important information. That's why he didn't care about his horse. The command horse rider immediately felt the urgency of the king-level expert. So, he couldn't help but urge, "Quick! Quickly! Quickly! You will lose your head if you delay this important matter." Therefore, more than 100 people rode 300 horses as they rushed forward with all their might. The cavalry team rushed north. A big mountain appeared in front of them after nearly an hour. They had arrived at the foot of the mountain. They were in a dense forest. The horse was so tired that it was foaming at the mouth. Chu Yang shouted and pulled the reins. The horse slowly stopped. The command horse rider overtook him like a whirlwind. He immediately turned his horse around and asked, "King-level expert, what's wrong? We'll take a short break. We'll start the operation soon." Jing Menghun spoke in an extremely serious tone. "Has the King of Hell escaped here?" the command horse rider asked in amazement. "This King of Hell Chu is very fast if that's the case." "Yes. King of Hell Chu is in this mountain," Jing Menghun said. "This will be a fierce battle. You must rest well and succeed in one fell swoop." "Yes. This subordinate thanks the king-level expert for his support." The command horse rider's eyes flashed with a blazing light. "Capturing King of Hell Chu is a great merit. My luck is really good. Fortunately, I was guarding the north gate. Moreover, it seems that the king-level expert has received the news. He didn't have time to mobilize the troops and rushed over." In his heart, this command horse rider had already found sufficient reasons for Chu Yang's actions. However, he couldn't be blamed for this. After all, Chu Yang hadn't changed his appearance at the moment. Instead, he had taken on the appearance of Jing Menghun. Therefore, the command horse rider had become suspicious even under such circumstances. It could only mean that this guy wanted to rebel. "All of you stay here and adjust your breathing. Be quick. I'll go in and take a look. Then I'll get something to eat," Chu Yang said coldly. The command horse rider wanted to say that it would be better for his subordinate to do it for him. But he didn't dare to say anything when he saw king-level expert Jing's grim and sinister face. King-level expert Jing's black robe fluttered as he entered the forest. The crowd outside looked on curiously. The command horse rider was furious and said, "Why aren't you adjusting your breathing and recovering your strength? The king-level expert personally went to look for food, you bastards." Everyone hurriedly agreed and sat down cross-legged, concentrating on regulating their breathing. After a short while, a wild boar's scream could be heard from the dense forest. A rustling sound was heard as king-level expert Jing flashed out of the jungle. He was carrying 2 large chunks of flesh on his shoulders. He was walking over in quick steps. With a bang, he threw 2 pieces of meat on the ground. They weighed at least 5 kilograms. "Roast this and eat it, quick!" King-level expert Jing ordered in a resolute and decisive manner. "I have removed his internal organs and pulled out his bones. Do you know how to roast meat?" "Yes." "Thank you, king-level expert. King-level expert is very considerate towards us. How can we dare to accept this?" The command horse rider started to flatter him. "What nonsense are you talking about? I'll give you a quarter of an hour to roast it and eat it." King-level expert Jing flew into a rage. He fiercely glared at him. "Yes, yes." The command horse rider's face was covered in cold sweat. He thought that he was too stupid. The king-level expert was obviously on fire. He didn't like anyone. How could he listen to flattery at this time? He turned around and issued a series of orders. You, quickly go to the forest and look for firewood. You, use your swords to set up a rack. You must roast it, and eat it in a quarter of an hour. You, go and separate the meat, quickly! Motherfucker, are you a fucking tortoise? After a series of orders, everyone started to get busy in full swing. These people were all experts. The weakest among them was a high-level martial great master. Their speed was very fast. The 2 pieces of meat were turned into pieces in the blink of an eye. There were a total of 103 pieces. Including Chu Yang, each person had a piece. The rarest thing was that other than Chu Yang's piece, the other pieces were of the same size. There was no deviation, and it was extremely fair. More than 30 barbecue racks were also firmly fixed on the ground. Soon after, people came out of the forest carrying withered branches. They quickly put them down, and then rushed in like a gust of wind. Tap, 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 a slight sound was heard. This was the sound of flint being struck. Soon after, thick smoke started to rise. The sizzling sound of barbecuing meat was also heard. The aroma of charred meat wafted out. Many people found that the meat was very delicate. Moreover, the smell of it was very delicious. It didn't seem like the meat of a wild boar. However, they looked at the king-level expert's dark face. He was sitting on the side like a star of death. His cold face seemed to freeze everyone. Who would dare to fart? It was already good enough to eat meat. What's more, it was such delicious meat. If some ignorant person went up and asked, "King-level expert, this doesn't seem to be the meat of a wild boar," 80% of the people were sure that the king-level expert would immediately jump up and scold. "Eat it if you don't want to. Get lost if you don't want to eat." Then, he would issue an order. "If you don't want to eat it, then you are not hungry." Then, set off immediately. If that was the case, everyone would want to cry but have no tears. It didn't take long for everyone to return. The firewood they had was enough for 3 rounds. Everyone was like a lake, so there was no need for anyone to organize them. The 3 of them sat around the barbecue grill. Some of them were even trying their best to use their essence force to stimulate the flames, making them burn brighter and brighter. There was only a quarter of an hour. If the meat was not cooked by then, the king-level expert would not wait. He would probably leave the meat here after it was done. Everyone would leave by themselves. With the king-level expert's current irritation, he would definitely do such a thing. Therefore, everyone was very obedient. Even the command horse rider lowered his head and looked at the barbecue. He didn't dare to let out a fart. His face was so ugly that it seemed as if he could kill anyone at any time. However, he was secretly happy in his heart. He looked at the poisonous flood dragon's meat being cut into pieces and roasted on the fire. It was emitting an enticing fragrance. Many of the pieces had been roasted until they were yellow. The fat was sizzling out of the meat. It fell into the fire, and emitted an even more fragrant smell. This poisonous flood dragon's meat is a first-class poison in the world. There is no antidote. Moreover, no one can detect the poison in it. This is a fucking treasure. It's a pity that I lost 50 kilograms of it this time, Chu Yang thought in his heart. His face was gloomy. From time to time, he would glare fiercely at the crowd. Every time he glanced at them, many of them would shudder at the same time. So, they became more and more respectful towards each other. "Is it not done yet?" King-level expert Jing asked impatiently. "It will be done soon." The command horse rider shivered. He almost put his hand into the fire, as he hastily replied. "Hurry up!" King-level expert Jing said in a stiff and cold voice. "Yes, yes." The command horse rider lowered his head. He tried his best to use his magic power to cook the meat, but the cold sweat on his forehead couldn't help but drip down. He was very worried. Would King-level expert Jing tear me apart if I had said one more word? King-level expert Jing is too scary. It's too frightening. It's no wonder that King-level Master Jing has been in a bad mood ever since King-level Master Kong was killed in battle, and King-level Master Jing was seriously injured and disabled. So, King-level Master Jing has been in a bad mood ever since. But this is pardonable. I would have been more irritable than King-level expert Jing if I had been in his place. The enemy who killed my brother is standing in front of me. It would be strange if king-level expert Jing can still maintain his normal state of mind. He suddenly felt a strong fragrance coming from the 2 pieces of roasted meat in his hand. He was pleasantly surprised as he shouted, "The meat is done! The meat is done! I swear to God!" This command horse rider had never felt so excited about a piece of roasted meat in his entire life. "My side is also done! Our meat is also done!" Everyone became excited. Many people swallowed their saliva as they greedily looked at the roasted meat in their hands. "This meat is very good. It's very appetizing. It's a pity that there's too little of it. It's barely enough to fill my stomach. King-level expert, I'll give you the meat." The command horse rider politely walked over and placed the best piece of meat in front of king-level expert. This piece of roasted meat was very good. It was charred on the outside and yellow on the inside. The oil was still bubbling on the surface of the meat. It was emitting an enticing fragrance. "Put it down!" King-level expert Jing's voice seemed to have softened. The command horse rider was secretly happy. But he heard king-level expert Jing roar again. "What are you looking at? The meat is done. Why aren't you eating it? Do you want me to ask you to eat it?" Everyone felt as if they had been granted amnesty as soon as these words were spoken. They grabbed the roasted meat in front of them and took a bite. Many people cursed in their hearts. "Fuck! Who dares to eat first if you don't speak? Motherfucker! It's a sin to wait for you to eat first. You're in a bad mood. You can't be such a bastard." The command horse rider also grabbed a piece of meat and took a big bite. He suddenly felt an indescribable taste enter his throat. It was so fragrant that his whole body felt comfortable. His eyes couldn't help but brighten. He grabbed that piece of meat and quickly swallowed it down. He threw the last bite into his mouth and chewed it carefully. He couldn't bear to swallow it down. He sighed and said, "Such a wonderful roasted meat. Even if I die, I won't die in vain. Thank you, king-level expert." Chapter 338. The command horse rider nodded vigorously, and finally swallowed the meat, with a flattering smile on his face. He earnestly said, "King-level master, this is the best barbecue I've ever eaten in my life. No, including the other dishes, this is the best food I've ever eaten in my life." His voice was sincere. It was obvious that these words weren't flattery, they were sincere. Then he saw king-level Master Jing smile strangely, and say, "I'm very pleased in that case." Then, the command horse rider suddenly felt that everything in front of his eyes had become somewhat blurry. He felt as if he was in a dream. His mind was in a daze. He even felt as if he had returned home. It was very warm, and very comfortable. Therefore, he slowly fell down with a smile on his face. Behind him, more than 100 people's bodies went limp, and they all wore comfortable smiles on their faces. Chu Yang calmly looked at more than 100 people slowly falling to the ground. They were lying on the ground in a disorderly manner. His eyes were ice cold. "Do I feel emotional? Yes. Do I feel sympathy? Not necessarily. Because my information has already been leaked, and these people will chase after my soul as long as my disguise lasts longer. They'll kill me for joy. There's no right or wrong in this world, there's no right or wrong. There are only different positions and different paths. There are only relatives and enemies, life and death." Chu Yang looked at the corpses on the ground. His eyes were ice cold. He insipidly said, "This is your path. And it's also my path. We've chosen this path of Jianghu. And this is our final destination. Today it's you. Perhaps it'll be me tomorrow. Therefore, I won't say sorry." 1. He was silent for a moment. Then, he walked to the side of the command horse rider, and took out Jing Menghun's identity token from his bosom. He stood still for about 2 breaths of time. Then he turned around. Chu Yang cut open his wrist with a puff sound. His blood carried a strange orchid fragrance as it flowed out. The pain of his muscles being torn apart assaulted him like a tidal wave. Chu Yang's eyes were calm and his face was indifferent. He carefully smeared his blood drop by drop on the horse's body. Then, he picked up the long whip. More than 300 horses were whipped to flee in all directions by him, galloping in all directions. The fragrance of orchids spread out, becoming fainter and fainter on the ground. Chu Yang's complexion was cold and solemn. He pulled over the remaining warhorse and jumped on it. Then, he clamped his legs together and endured the dizziness brought about by the blood loss. He galloped towards the north without looking back. On the ground, corpses were scattered all over the place. The sound of the horses' hooves was like thunder, rolling away without looking back. My goal is clear. I'm heading north. Diwu Ro, stop me if you have the ability. I, Chu Yang, will not beat around the bush with you. Because I'm running out of time. If I take a roundabout route in order to escape, then, that would be exactly what Diwu Ro wants. I'm afraid that the war will break out before I can even return to Iron Cloud. Moreover, Diwu Ro will try his best to take advantage of my absence, and use all means to maximize the victory. Chu Yang couldn't bear the consequences. Therefore, even though he was already heavily injured, and could die at any moment, and even though he clearly knew that he would definitely die on this journey of 10,000 miles back, and that he might even die in the wilderness at any time, he still chose the shortest route, and used the fastest speed he could achieve to rush back as quickly as possible. Chu Yang knew that Diwu Ro was aware of his plan. Therefore, Chu Yang also knew that this journey of 10,000 miles would be a matter of life and death for him. It was the best opportunity for Diwu Ro to kill him. However, he had no other choice. The sound of the horses' hooves faded away. Jing Menghun's black robe fluttered in the wind as he frantically swept back and forth over the continent's citadel. He knew the serious consequences of King of Hell Chu's escape. He also knew that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Moreover, it was the key to the victory of the war between the two nations. Therefore, he was very careful. He even used his highest skill to search. He didn't let go of any nook and cranny. However, he didn't find anything. King of Hell Chu had been like a drop of water falling into the sea ever since he had left the Qing Prime Minister's residence. There wasn't any movement from him. The Golden Horse Riders Department had mobilized a total of 250,000 soldiers to conduct a net-like investigation. They had combed through the entire province. However, there was no news. Jing Menghun had to admit that 2 hours had passed since he couldn't find the target along the way. All the orchids in every flower shop in the city had been thoroughly destroyed. This was enough to ensure that there was no smell of orchids in this huge continent city. King of Hell Chu could be found as long as the fragrance of orchids appeared. However, the fragrance of orchids didn't appear. Jing Menghun finally arrived at the north gate after a round of searching. He became furious when he saw the situation. What's going on? Who allowed you to open the gate? The officer guarding the gate had a strange reaction when he saw Jing Menghun arrive. He opened his mouth wide and stared as if he had seen a ghost. Jing Menghun angrily said, "What's going on? Why are you looking at me like that? King Level Master Jing! King Level Master Jing, you didn't go out of the city?" The officer looked at Jing Menghun stutteringly, and scratched his head in confusion. King Level Master Jing had obviously led the people of Golden Horse Riders Department to chase after Chu Yang. How could he appear here alone? Could he be a spy? He recalled that King Level Master Jing had gone out with an imposing aura of magnificent army with thousands of men and horses, that tyrannical aura of swallowing rivers and mountains, that carefree and unrestrained manner of whizzing. The officer increasingly felt that the one who had gone out was the real one. He looked at Jing Menghun's anxious and angry face. "What are you angry about? You're a spy. You're anxious because you have a guilty conscience." The more he thought about it, the more he felt that this man was suspicious, and the more he thought about it, the more he felt that this was a great opportunity for him. The officer suddenly became alert. He took 2 steps back. Then, he suddenly raised his hand and shouted, "Everyone! Be on guard! Archers at the ready! Hundreds of big bows were loaded with iron arrows with a schwa sound. The bowstrings creaked as they were drawn. The shiny arrowheads were aimed at Jing Menghun. Jing Menghun almost went mad with anger. He roared, "What are you doing? Do you want to rebel?" The officer stood proudly on the city wall and looked down at Jing Menghun. The corners of his mouth exposed a trace of a sneer as he said in a mocking tone, "Rebel? He, capture this fake king-level Master Jing, for me." The last few words were spoken in a stern tone. A trace of fanaticism appeared in the officer's eyes. "This fake king-level Master Jing is most likely King of Hell Chu. It would be wonderful if King of Hell Chu is captured by me, ha ha ha." Promotion, riches, and titles of marquis and generals. The officer trembled with excitement as he thought of such a beautiful future. He was so happy that he almost fainted. The city gate was closed at the same time. The soldiers who were guarding the city gate quickly mounted their horses, and formed a huge arrowhead in an instant. Thousands of horses galloped towards Jing Menghun and rushed towards him. A team of infantrymen followed the cavalrymen under the command of their commanding officer. They dispersed and circled around to outflank Jing Menghun. The sound of the bugle horn was loud and clear. The soldiers surrounded Jing Menghun from all directions, and surged forward like a surging tide. They formed the most powerful fighting force in the shortest time possible. The infantrymen, cavalrymen, and archers formed a cross of firepower, and surrounded Jing Menghun. Great Zhao's army was ferocious and elite, and had displayed their ferociousness. However, the elite operation this time had targeted the wrong target. Jing Menghun was furious. He had never imagined that he would encounter such a situation when he had been searching for King of Hell Chu at the most important location of the northern city gate. "This is absurd!" He let out a loud shout. His black robe flashed, and he flew high into the air. The dense arrows hit his body, and issued puff sounds, and then bounced back. His skin was as hard as steel under the influence of his tyrannical king-level strength. Swords and spears couldn't penetrate his skin. His hands continuously stretched out, and grabbed a human body with bang sounds. He then threw it out. Jing Menghun was furious. But he knew that this was a misunderstanding. Moreover, it was a crucial misunderstanding. Therefore, he was very careful in his actions. He would only throw people out. He wouldn't cause any casualties. He leaped like a whirlwind, and broke through the swords and spears that were standing in a forest. He then flew up to the top of the city wall with a loud shout. He then slapped his palms on the battlements, and jumped up, and landed in front of the officer with a schwa sound. His big hands were like pliers as he grabbed the officer. The officer was startled. He was about to dodge, but Jing Menghun had already grabbed him. Jing Menghun got to know what had happened from the frightened officer after a quarter of an hour had passed. "I'm so angry!" Jing Menghun was so angry that he was about to go crazy. He was so angry that the hair on his head stood erect. He then shouted, and lifted this guy up, and threw him down the city wall. A bright flower of blood appeared in front of the city gate with a puff sound. Jing Menghun didn't hesitate. He blew the special communications signal of the Golden Horse Riders Department. Then, he rolled out from the top of the city wall like a wisp of black smoke. However, he didn't notice that while he was raging, a figure had already flashed and disappeared outside the city. Jing Menghun was frantically galloping towards the north along the arches of his horse's hooves. He was unceasingly whistling in a high-pitched manner. Teams of experts of the Golden Horse Riders Department were gathering in the city. Then, they were gathering towards the northern gate from all directions. They were moving at an extremely fast speed. They were constantly galloping out of the city like lightning. People were shouting and horses were neighing. But they were moving in an orderly manner in this chaotic place. Nobody had spoken a word during the entire process. Chapter 339. Jing Menghun chased for half an hour. The mountain was in sight, and the forest was right in front of his eyes. Suddenly, his whole body shook. His eyes were lifeless as he stood on the spot. His mind suddenly became blank. Corpses were strewn all over the ground in front of him. They were the experts of the Golden Horse Riders Department who had been guarding the northern gate. 103 of them had died an unnatural death. The north gate was to guard against King of Hell Chu's escape. Therefore, Jing Menghun had arranged the best of the best. Moreover, they were all Jing Menghun's trusted subordinates. But now, these people were all dead. A black-clothed figure stood next to these corpses. Who is it? Jing Menghun felt as if his heart was being fried. He shouted and rushed forward. The black-clothed man held his hands behind his back and slowly turned around. His cold eyes looked at Jing Menghun's face. He coldly snorted and said, "It's me." Jing Menghun's rushing body suddenly stopped. He exclaimed, "Prime Minister?" It was Diwu Qingro. "They have left more than an hour ago," Diwu Qingro said quietly. "Left then, they?" Jing Menghun looked at his men lying on the ground. The muscles on his face twitched. "Dead? They died peacefully?" Diwu Qingro's voice was very strange. It was hard to tell whether it was pity or ridicule. He said, "In fact, they died happily. They willingly took the poison given to them by King of Hell Chu. Then, they died here with great satisfaction. There were no traces of fighting from beginning to end. How is this possible?" Jing Menghun was stunned. He looked at the faces of the corpses. He saw that each of them had a faint smile on their faces. They looked very peaceful and satisfied. Looking at their faces, one would know that they were very happy. Very happy. However, they had lost their lives in such a happy place. Jing Menghun quivered and shuddered. He couldn't imagine how King of Hell Chu had done all this. More than 100 martial great masters and above. These were not 100 pigs. Even if King of Hell Chu had disguised himself, how could there be no flaws? Even if he didn't break, how could his life be so peaceful when he let more than 100 of his subordinates die by poison? Jing Menghun suddenly felt a chill run down his spine as he looked at the frozen smiles on the corpses' faces. Then, he smelled the faint orchid fragrance that seemed to be pervading in all directions. "It should be a kind of strange poison," Diwu Qingro insipidly said. "A kind of strange meat." Diwu Qingro's voice had an indescribable flavor. It seemed as if he was deep in thought. Even with Diwu Qingro's knowledge, he couldn't tell what kind of poison it was. His heart couldn't help but tremble because he couldn't detect this poison. What if he ate it? Jing Menghun nodded blankly. His mind had yet to recover from the shock. King of Hell Chu smeared his blood on hundreds of horses, and then left. "There's orchid fragrance in all directions, no one is tracking you." Diwu Qingro shot a cold glance at Jing Menghun. "I don't need to tell you what to do next, do I?" Jing Menghun was startled. He regained his senses and replied, "Yes." Diwu Qingro coldly snorted and said, "Lock the entire northern frontier. Jing Menghun, bring your head to me if you can't catch King of Hell Chu." "Yes." Jing Menghun's heart sank. Diwu Qingro's words showed that he was very dissatisfied with him. King of Hell Chu is really vicious and merciless. You can even do it to yourself. Diwu Qingro slowly paced 2 steps. He raised his head and smelled the orchid fragrance that was drifting in the air. He shook his head and sneered. It's strange that he could see through my spine's soul-breaking palm. But he didn't hesitate to injure himself in order to smear more than 100 horses to escape in all directions even though he was seriously injured. This is really bold. With such boldness, he is indeed a great threat. Diwu Qingro faintly smiled. He looked at the mountain forest, lost in thought for a while. Then, he smiled again. King of Hell Chu is seriously injured. And he's bleeding himself. He's courting his own death. Jing Menghun's anger towards Chu Yang had reached its peak. He felt that he was in an embarrassing situation because of Chu Yang. So, he spoke without any trace of politeness. Put yourself in a situation of death and fight to live. Diwu Qingro sighed softly. His tone was slow as if he had recalled something. He then slowly said, You need to be in a situation of death in order to live. You can't even believe that you can erupt with power. You can either sink or soar to the sky. If you don't force yourself into a situation of death, someone else will. You can still survive if you force yourself into a situation of death. But if someone else forces you into it, you'll be consigned to eternal damnation. Diwu Qingro looked at the rain clouds floating above the mountain forest with a complicated look in his eyes. He spoke in a very disappointed and frustrated tone. After a long time, he smiled and said in a low voice, "So you should force yourself into a situation of death before someone else has the time to force you into a situation of death. Force yourself as much as you can. The worst result is nothing more than death. But it's much easier to die in one's own hands than in someone else's hands." Diwu Qingro sighed softly. He suddenly turned his head to look at Jing Menghun. His tone suddenly became gentle and even a little regretful. "Menggui, you're forcing yourself too much. Otherwise, you wouldn't be a mere king-level expert with your achievements." Jing Menghun stood there in a daze as he listened to these words. He felt as if he had been struck by lightning. Yes, he had reached the level of a king-level expert over the years. But he hadn't dared to enter the lower heavens. Because he knew that there were countless king-level experts in the lower three heavens. He was merely a king-level expert. He could be called a king in the lower three heavens. But he could only be recruited in the lower three heavens. He would be consigned to eternal damnation if he said something wrong and offended a certain force. Therefore, he would rather stay in the lower three heavens. He would rather enjoy the extravagant lifestyle of the secular world. But he didn't dare to take the next step. It wasn't that he couldn't break through to a king-level expert. It was just that he couldn't. It was because he was full of fear towards that strange world. His cultivation hadn't made any progress in the past 10 years because of this mentality. The spiritual energy of spirit beasts needed to break through the king-level expert and enter the emperor-level expert had to be obtained in the Tsunlan battlefront. He couldn't go there. So, he couldn't get it. This cycle repeated itself. His current embarrassing situation was actually due to his own cowardice. Where had he thrown away the fearless desperado spirit that he had before breaking through to the king-level expert? Why had he become a coward? Could it be that he had become a coward at the time of a breakthrough? Jing Menghun couldn't help but sweat profusely as he thought of this. But he was still afraid of entering the lower three heavens even though he was aware of this. Jing Menghun would never be willing to abandon everything and enter the lower three heavens if he was asked to do so. It was easy to know, but difficult to do. This was the truth. Taking a step forward would mean that the sky was high and the earth was wide. But if he didn't take this step, he would still be as wide as the sea and the sky. This was a kind of mentality. And this kind of mentality was very strange. But it was very difficult to understand. It was just like in modern times. Some bosses would go all out when they didn't have anything. They would build a family business with their bare hands. They would only need the courage to take the next step. And they would be able to get listed on the stock market. Or they could achieve greater development. But countless people would shrink back at this critical time. Less than 1 in 1,000 people would dare to take this step. It was because they were thinking, "I'm already famous. Why should I take such a big risk? I would be consigned to eternal damnation in case I fail. And I would return to poverty once again." Only a few people would be able to succeed even if they dared to take this step. The winner would laugh proudly in the clouds. And the loser would return to poverty. It would be very difficult for a person to take this step even if he were to worry about personal gains and losses for a long time. It was because of his mentality. He wouldn't be able to forge ahead if he was worried about personal gains and losses. Therefore, there would always be a small number of powerhouses in any world and any time. This was the case whether it was in the martial way or in the business world. This couldn't be changed since ancient times. Diwu Qingro had been carefully observing Jing Menghun's demeanor. He finally sighed and said, "The reason why King of Hell Chu is King of Hell Chu isn't because of his high wisdom. Rather, it's because he has been struggling on the verge of death since his debut. Therefore, he has been able to create one miracle after another. Such miracles aren't due to King of Hell Chu's strength. Rather, it's because he was forced to step on the road of death. He forced a genius out of a hopeless situation. The times create heroes. This is how it is. Meng Hun, you've disappointed me. Du Qingro sighed after he finished speaking. Then, his body floated away like the wind. He disappeared from this world in the blink of an eye. The sound of horse hooves thundered in the distance. The people of the Golden Horse Riders Department rushed over like a swarm of bees. Jing Menghun stood there in a daze. He didn't move for a long time. Du Qingro had already gone far away. Du Qingro had been looking forward to Jing Menghun. Jing Menghun's martial arts were profound, and he was proficient in medicine. Moreover, he was still young. But he had already achieved so much. He could be regarded as a genius of the Chongtian continent. There were many younger people in the upper three heavens who had more achievements than Jing Menghun. But one must know that this was the upper three heavens. It couldn't be compared to the lower three heavens. Jing Menghun's achievements in the barren lower three heavens were something to be proud of. No one in the upper three heavens would dare to ignore such an achievement. Therefore, Du Qingro had been looking forward to Jing Menghun breaking through his heart's devil. He would have to leave the lower three heavens after this battle. It didn't matter if he won or lost. He would have taken Jing Menghun with him if he had untied the knot in his heart. He would have given Jing Menghun a bright future. He would have become an emperor-level expert in the shortest time possible. However, Du Qingro had pointed out Jing Menghun's heart's devil. And Jing Menghun had finally lost his mind. He had talent, luck, perseverance, and opportunity. Chapter 340. Du Qingro had been waiting for Jing Menghun to break through this mental state. The results of a breakthrough and someone else's advice were completely different. This was directly related to Jing Menghun's future achievements. However, Jing Menghun still hadn't made a breakthrough to this day. Du Qingro had felt that Chu Yang had repeatedly struggled to survive from the jaws of death. He had repeatedly created miracles. Therefore, he had been moved to remind Jing Menghun. However, Jing Menghun still hesitated even after he understood the situation. But Du Qingro still couldn't make up his mind. So, he left disappointed. Jing Menghun would have turned into a walking corpse if he had been forcibly brought into the upper three heavens. Du Qingro's judgment of Chu Yang was also extremely accurate. Du Qingro was much better than Chu Yang in terms of intelligence and strategy. However, Chu Yang was far behind when it came to playing politics. However, there was one thing that Du Qingro could never match up to. This was because he had no way out. He could only move forward and succeed. Once he failed, he would be consigned to eternal damnation. Therefore, Chu Yang's obsession with success was 10,000 times stronger than Du Qingro's. He had already gambled his entire life on this. He was walking on a tightrope all the time. One wrong step and he would be consigned to eternal damnation. Especially since Chu Yang still had two great weapons in his hands, the experience of a lifetime, and the Calamity Sword. This was something that Du Qingro could not compare to no matter how much of a genius he was. But Du Qingro was different. Du Qingro had a way out, and not just one. Therefore, the difference between Du Qingro and Chu Yang was also in the state of mind. Just as Jing Menghun couldn't break through his cowardly state of mind, Du Qingro couldn't reach Chu Yang's level either. Du Qingro's pursuit of Chu Yang was only his first attempt. Chu Yang has escaped. So, I will leave the follow-up to Jing Menghun and the Golden Horse Riders Department. However, Du Qingro had a lot of things on his hands. Nothing could be done without him. Therefore, he could only rush back to the Prime Minister's manor to preside over the general situation and prepare for the expedition. If the same thing were to happen to Chu Yang, it would be very different. Chu Yang would definitely chase Du Qingro for thousands of miles to cut him down under his saber. Because Chu Yang clearly knew that if Du Qingro didn't die, the whole world would fall into his hands. However, Du Qingro did not have such an understanding. Moreover, Di Wuqingro was confident that everything was under his control. If he had known in advance that all his efforts and life's work would be ruined by Chu Yang's hands, and that he would have achieved nothing, he would have chased after Chu Yang to kill him. But the problem was, he didn't know. Jing Menghun quickly put away his chaotic state of mind, and continued to issue orders. However, he still hadn't realized that he had made a huge mistake. He had only known that someone had impersonated him, and had gone out of the northern gate. Then, Jing Menghun had gotten angry, and had slapped the officer who was guarding the gate to death. Then, he had chased after that person. He didn't know about his jade pendant. Moreover, this matter was very complicated and confusing. To be honest, Jing Menghun was still confused. Who did I give that jade pendant to? Di Wuqingru said that it might be Tribulation Sword Master, but it was only a possibility. Moreover, he wouldn't have connected the jade pendant with King of Hell Chu. Therefore, this oversight was not something that could be excused. The net of the Golden Horse Riders Department stretched all the way from the provincial capital to the north. Jing Menghun had focused all of his attention on the area 1,300 miles north of the provincial capital. That was because there was a continuous mountain forest here. Moreover, this was the only way to Iron Cloud. No matter where one went, they couldn't avoid it. Moreover, 400,000 soldiers of Great Zhao's army were gathering here. King of Hell Chu would have nowhere to hide in this uninhabited mountain forest for thousands of miles. Invisible falcons had already sent a message to the army, and 100,000 soldiers had already moved to seal off the entire mountain forest. In fact, this continuous mountain forest for thousands of miles was the most insurmountable moat in Chu Yang's plan. Chu Yang had taken the initiative to escape from the current situation, but it wasn't optimistic at all. It was still dangerous at every step. It was a matter of life and death. The most tragic part was that no one in Iron Cloud knew that King of Hell Chu was facing such a life and death crisis. Therefore, Chu Yang was isolated and without help. He could only fight alone. He had to contend with millions of people by himself. Moreover, he had suffered a fatal injury. Right now, Chu Yang had already crossed over the mountain. He was rushing towards the nearest mountain pass at top speed. There were less than 2 hours left before the 6-hour disguise deadline. This was the first mountain pass in the northern part of the province. No matter what, even if he wanted to break into the forest that stretched for thousands of miles, he had to get out of here first. Moreover, Chu Yang also had to enter that continuous mountain forest. His body was seriously injured, and he had to replenish his medicinal herbs. If he were to rely on the medicinal efficacies stored in the sword spirit's body, he would sooner or later run out of medicinal efficacies. At that time, he would collapse with a loud bang. He wouldn't even need to wait for the Golden Horse Riders Department to make a move. Therefore, he had to use Jing Menghun's identity to cross this mountain pass within 2 hours. It didn't matter whether Yuan Menghun was aware of it or not. However, he had to take this risk. A strong horse galloped out of the mountain forest like an angry dragon. It left the dust in its wake, and arrived at the mountain pass like a whirlwind. His black robe fluttered in the wind, and his face was stern. The imposing aura of the first king-level expert of the Golden Horse Riders Department swept out arrogantly like a surging tide. "Open the gate!" These 2 words seemed to contain supreme authority. No one could question them. The officer guarding the mountain pass was about to speak when someone beside him exclaimed, "King-level expert Jing?" "Humph!" Chu Yang snorted coldly. His horsewhip flashed in the air with a bang sound. The sound reverberated for miles. Chu Yang didn't say anything. He just looked at that expert of the Golden Horse Riders Department with a cold and stern look in his eyes. "Quickly open the gate!" the revered martial artist hastily ordered. The officer guarding this city didn't know what was going on. But he knew that he couldn't afford to provoke this man. So, he quickly opened the gate, and the drawbridge was slowly lowered. Chu Yang coldly waved his hand and said, "Come down!" Then, he clamped his legs, and the black robe on his black horse rushed into the mountain pass like a black cloud. Chu Yang dismounted from his horse as soon as he entered. He then whipped the face of the officer who was guarding the gate, and said angrily, "What are you waiting for? Why aren't you bringing the horses over to feed them?" The officer covered his face. His eyes were filled with fear and anger. "Isn't this man too overbearing? Motherfucker, do you think you're a king-level expert of the Golden Horse Riders Department?" He was thinking this when a man rushed towards him like a meteor. He shouted from afar, "King-level expert! King-level expert, why are you here?" "It's the king-level expert of the Golden Horse Riders Department?" The officer was shocked and obediently took the reins of the horse. He took care of the horse as if it was his ancestor. "If I didn't come, do you think you can stop King of Hell Chu?" Chu Yang heavily snorted. He strode forward as he spoke in a hurried tone. "I will be waiting in front of the City Lord's mansion within 10 breaths. Everyone from the Golden Horse Riders Department must gather here. Those who don't arrive within the time limit will be executed." "Yes!" The revered martial artist broke out in cold sweat. Almost in an instant, the order was sent out. A group of experts of the Golden Horse Riders Department had followed behind him. They were scared out of their wits. Suddenly, they let out a strange cry, and scattered in all directions like birds and beasts. Chu Yang strode forward and coldly said, "Have you received the news?" "We have received it, only." "There is no only," Chu Yang shouted in a low voice. "If you catch King of Hell Chu, everything will be fine. If you don't catch King of Hell Chu, no one will be able to escape punishment. Including me. No only can save you. Do you understand?" "Yes. King-level expert is right." The revered martial artist bowed his head as he followed King of Hell Chu's footsteps. He stammered, "But... King-level expert, you, smack." Chu Yang turned sideways and fiercely slapped his face. Then, he grabbed his lapel and coldly stared at him. He said in a heavy voice, "What but? From now on you... Shut up. Listen to my orders." "Yes." The revered martial artist's face was burning, but he didn't dare to touch it. His body was straight. Cold sweat had already seeped out of his back. King-level expert's temper today is really rare. Don't blame me for having a bad temper. This is a serious matter. Chu Yang's voice softened as he walked. This matter has angered the Prime Minister. Everyone in the Golden Horse Riders Department, including me, has been punished. Only you outside have not been implicated. If you don't know how lucky you are, I don't mind helping you to loosen your skin." "Yes." The revered martial artist shivered, "So that's how it is." While they were talking, the City Lord's residence came into view. The chubby City Lord was scared witless as he came to greet them. He had just reached the door when he heard an extremely cold shout. "Stop! Go back!" He looked up and saw a cold-faced man in a black robe striding towards him. His eyes were sharp like a hawk's as he looked at him. It was as if a goshawk had seen a fat rabbit. "I don't have any interest in receiving your greetings. Don't say a word. Go back!" Chu Yang's eyes and eyebrows were raised. He was extremely impatient as he shouted in an irritated manner. He was extremely tyrannical and overbearing. Only a person who could control the life and death of a person in front of him was qualified to shout like this. "Yes! Yes!" The chubby city lord was so scared by this murderous aura that he almost dropped his pants on the spot. He suddenly trembled, but didn't stop rushing. He immediately turned around and ran back. But he couldn't turn his body's center of gravity. So, he twisted his body. His posture was very strange, and he did a beautiful spinning dance. Then, he fell down with a plop. His two fat legs were unimaginably twisted into the shape of a fried dough twist. It wouldn't be surprising if a skinny person twisted his legs. But this fat person who was more than 250 kilograms had twisted his legs into a fried dough twist. It was really amazing. Chapter 341. Trash! You dirty my eyes by looking at you! Chu Jian cursed in disgust and kicked his fat buttocks. Immediately, with a whooshing sound, the fat city guard, who had short arms and legs and a big belly, flew over the wall like a rubber ball. With a horrified cry, the fat city guard fell into the wall from afar while flailing his arms and legs. A crashing sound was heard. It was unknown what he had knocked over. The experts of the Golden Horse Riders Department rushed over from all directions. It seemed as if their buttocks were on fire. They saw the revered martial artist standing solemnly. He was constantly signaling with his eyes. So, they didn't dare to breathe. They stood motionless in bewilderment. Whooshing! Whooshing! Everyone had arrived. Is everyone here? Chu Yang fiercely turned around. He looked at everyone with his sharp eyes. His speed was extremely fast. However, the ruthlessness and murderous intention in his eyes made everyone shiver. Reporting back to the king-level expert. Everyone is here. The revered martial artist stood at attention and replied. Good. Chu Yang took 2 steps forward. Now, I will announce the mission. Everyone stood at attention. They looked at Chu Yang with shining eyes. This mission is to kill King of Hell Chu at all costs. We won't care about any sacrifices. Chu Yang slowly paced back and forth. His eyes flashed with a fierce brilliance. He swept his eyes over everyone's faces like an eagle. Now everyone, follow me. Everyone didn't know what was going on. So, they took a few steps forward. They surrounded Chu Yang. Chu Yang secretly operated his martial power. His blood boiled, and the orchid fragrance rose from his blood. Everyone's nostrils twitched at the same time. They could smell the simple and elegant orchid fragrance. Meanwhile, Chu Yang's sharp eyes swept over everyone again. He then said in a heavy voice, "You can smell it, right?" Everyone nodded. King of Hell Chu has been hit by the spine soul-breaking hard palm. His body will have this orchid fragrance, as long as he doesn't die. What you are smelling now is this unique orchid fragrance. Do you understand? Chu Yang said in a dignified manner. Understood. Everyone stuck out their chests. It's good that you understand. A strange smile appeared on Chu Yang's Jing Menghun's face as he continued to speak in a gloomy manner. Now, everyone will accompany me. We will break through the north gate and capture the King of Hell. He paused for a moment before continuing in a sinister tone. Everyone should understand how important this matter is. If anything happens, don't blame me for being merciless. Yes. Dozens of people stood at attention and roared. Everyone's faces were immediately filled with eagerness. Now, let's set off. Chu Yang waved his hand. Bring the horses over. With a schwa sound, everyone mounted their horses at the same time, ready to set off. At this moment, the faint sound of wings flapping could be heard from the sky. An invisible bird suddenly appeared in the sky and landed on the revered martial artist's body. What is it? Give it to me! Chu Yang's sharp eyes swept over, and he shouted decisively. He knew that if he was not mistaken, it would be the latest news about him. Yes. That revered martial artist didn't suspect anything. He grabbed the invisible bird, took the letter, and respectfully presented it to Chu Yang with both hands. He would have never dreamt that this awe-inspiring king-level expert Jing was actually the biggest target of the Golden Horse Riders Department's operation, King of Hell Chu. Chu Yang quickly opened the letter and glanced at it. Then, he insipidly said, "The latest news is that King of Hell Chu has entered the Qilong Mountains. We must immediately rush over, for the first batch of troops. Do you understand?" Understood. Everyone became excited. The first batch of troops to capture King of Hell Chu? Doesn't this mean that such a monstrous merit will fall on our shoulders? It's good that you understand. Chu Yang straddled his horse. He pointed his horsewhip forward, and waved his hand. It seemed as if the imaginary King of Hell Chu was already waiting there for them to capture him. He then shouted with full confidence. Gentlemen! Now is the time to make a contribution. Let's go! He clamped his legs, and the horse rushed out. Now is the time to make a contribution. Let's go! Dozens of people issued strange shouts at the same time. They spurred their horses, and followed behind king-level expert Jing. They were extremely excited as they rushed out. 50 horses formed a tyrannical whirlwind inside the mountain pass. They tyrannically rushed out of the street, rushed out of the mountain pass, and rushed out of the north gate. Chu Yang jumped out of the suspension bridge with his horse with a crashing sound. He looked at the lush green mountains in the distance. His eyes emitted a fervent radiance as he waved his hand and said, "Kill the last one!" Ah! Everyone issued a shout, and rushed forward as if their lives depended on it. Jing Menghun hurriedly arrived with a large group of people less than an hour after Chu Yan had left. He shouted in anger when he learned about this matter. He almost fell off his horse and died. Chu Yang's eyes were wide open. Jing Menghun had rushed over with a large group of people. The opposite party had used the same method to escape. Moreover, they had used his own appearance. Jing Menghun was going crazy. He issued a series of orders. He roared for a while, and then chased after Chu Yang. Then, the army set out from the mountain pass. Several invisible insects fluttered their wings and flew away to inform the checkpoint in front of them to surround and capture King of Hell Chu. Jing Menghun clenched his teeth, and secretly swore in his heart, "This kind of trick can't be used again. King of Hell Chu, you've entered this mountain forest. You've entered a dangerous place. I swear I won't be a man if I don't kill you." Chu Yang was alone. His whole body was dyed green as he walked through the dense forest. He had just lost more than 40 kilograms of poisonous flood dragon's meat. The price was 50 experts of the Golden Horse Riders Department lying quietly in the forest. But it was still effortless. More than 100 experts of the Golden Horse Riders Department had died at his hands since he had come out of the provincial capital. He would have been flustered if there had been more than a dozen of these experts in a face-to-face confrontation. However, he had taken advantage of Jing Menghun's identity to poison them to death without even lifting a finger. Chu Yang was very happy about this matter. However, the sword spirit's make-up technique had reached the time limit of 3 hours. So, Chu Yang had restored his original appearance. Silently, like a leopard cat, he walked through the dense green forest. The sword point of the tribulation sword was flickering with an almost invisible radiance on his right finger. Chu Yang was constantly changing directions according to the sword point of the tribulation sword. The sword point was the best at finding elixirs. The conversation between Chu Yang and the sword spirit had given him a lot of inspiration. The mountains and forests are the best places to find the elixirs of the world. The mountains and forests are certainly more dangerous. It's not good for concealing one's identity. But there are many places where one can hide. Mountains, rivers, flowers, trees, all of them can be used as a cover. One can't even see the mountains as a cover, let alone a single person. All the treasured spirit herbs in the world grow in places where people rarely go. Most of them are found in mountains and forests. The rest are found underwater. But less than 1/10 of these elixirs are discovered by humans. Most of them grow silently for thousands of years, and then quietly dissipate between heaven and earth. When the spiritual energy gathers, they grow again into other treasures. Your current injury can't be treated by the tribulation sword's medicinal power, but it doesn't mean that heaven and earth can't. In front of heaven and earth, there are no fatal injuries or incurable diseases, because heaven and earth are immortal. Everything will depend on your fate. But as the owner of the tribulation sword, Yuaner is definitely not weak. Chu Yang laughed in his heart. If my fate was weak, how could I have gotten the tribulation sword? Under a pine tree, Chu Yang placed the sword point of the tribulation sword on his right index finger accurately on the ground. The green plant stem that came into contact with the sword point of the tribulation sword withered at a speed visible to the naked eye. The mountains and forests are indeed full of treasures. Chu Yang couldn't help but sigh in his heart. He had just entered the forest for less than 15 minutes, but he had already absorbed 300-year-old wild ginseng and a red Ganoderma. This time, the sword point of the tribulation sword didn't retain any medicinal power. Instead, it sent all of it into the tribulation space and handed it over to the sword's spirit. And the sword's spirit immediately filled the original medicinal power, transforming it into energy and sending it into Chu Yang's meridians. The sword point of the tribulation sword flickered and clearly pointed in another direction. Chu Yang's heart skipped a beat. His body silently floated up and flew quickly in that direction. Not long after, he stopped and searched for a while. He couldn't help but smile in joy. In front of him, in a large patch of extremely dense grass that reached his waist, there was a green plant that wasn't even as tall as a palm. On the plant, 3 green fruits quietly stayed on the branches. The grass fruit was an extremely rare elixir. Although it only ripened once every 3 years, it was extremely rare because it was extremely hard to find. Many prescriptions had this medicine, but they were basically replaced with other herbs. For example, the grass in front of him was waist high. This patch of grass was hundreds of feet tall, but the grass fruit was at the root of the grass. Moreover, whether it was the roots or the fruits, they were the same color as the grass. Even if it was close at hand, it would be difficult to find it if one widened their eyes. If it wasn't for the tribulation sword, he would have long been far away. Who would have the patience to look for him in a pile of grass? The sword point of the tribulation sword touched it, and the 3 fruits disappeared instantly. The emerald green plant withered and disappeared without a trace. While Chu Yang was running, he felt that there was a sudden surge of vitality in his meridians. And this time, for the first time, the vitality entered his 5 internal organs that were wrapped by the sword's spirit and slowly healed. Chu Yang couldn't help but be curious. This grass fruit was just a rare herb, and not some kind of heavenly treasure. Why was it this herb that entered his 5 internal organs for the first time? It's not only heavenly treasures and rare elixirs that can heal injuries and illnesses. Ordinary herbs are more effective than heavenly treasures as long as they target the illness. The sword spirit's voice slowly sounded. You must know this principle. Chapter 342. That's right, treating injuries and illnesses. It wasn't just about using natural treasures to treat the illness. By the same logic, defeating the enemy wasn't just about using ultimate moves or killing moves. Instead, it was about finding and using the opponent's flaws. Ordinary moves could also be used to turn something rotten into something magical. As Chu Yang thought about it, he felt that his understanding of martial arts had deepened. He flew all the way, nimbly jumping from tree to tree. His body was like the wind. Calamity's sword tip was on his index finger. It stuck its head out and probed with all its might. The sword tip also seemed to know that this was a matter of life and death for its master. It didn't dare to be negligent. Therefore, no matter what medicinal herbs it found, it would guide Chu Yang to absorb them all. It wouldn't let go of them. Poisonous ones, non-poisonous ones, useful ones, and useless ones. Even some ordinary Solomon's seal, angelica, and so on were all absorbed. As for ginseng, ganoderma, fleece flower, and so on, it wouldn't let go of them either. Sometimes, every time it absorbed an ordinary medicinal herb, Chu Yang could feel the grievance and resentment of the sword tip. It was estimated that in tens of thousands of years, Calamity's sword had never been as hungry as it was now. It had never absorbed anything that wasn't precious medicinal herbs. It was like a person who was used to eating exotic delicacies, but now only ate vegetables and tofu every day. No wonder it felt wrong. Rustling sounds could be heard from far behind. There were also some faint roars. The pursuers were not far away. Chu Yang frowned. Then, he used his hands to cut down a stalk of grass from an inconspicuous place. He had covered a distance of 3 miles in a flash. So, the grass in his hands had already turned into a big clump of grass. He fiercely squeezed the grass, and silently crushed it into a ball. Then, he exerted more force, and drops of thick green grass juice dripped out. Chu Yang caught it with his palm, and wiped it all over his body, face, and head. He wiped a layer on his skin and then dyed his clothes with another layer. Then, he continued to do the same thing. He squeezed the grass juice and kept it in the calamity space. He only stopped when he had collected nearly a bucket. It was enough for more than 10 times. This was something that had to be considered when escaping from the forest. The smell of the human body was completely different from this fresh forest. Not to mention that he was running vigorously. Not to mention that his blood could emit that deadly orchid fragrance at any time. The smell of grass was the most natural smell in the world. Whether it was the sap of the trees or the smell of the herbs, none of them were as natural as the smell of grass. Moreover, it was able to conceal all sense. While Chu Yang was running, the tip of the calamity sword suddenly vibrated excitedly. A few hands seemed to want to break free from his fingers and pointed in a direction. Chu Yang took a look and saw that there was a canyon about 100 feet away from him. He couldn't help but laugh bitterly and say, "Little guy, the pursuers are right behind us. Even if there are good things there, we won't be able to escape once we go down and come back up." The sword tip of Calamity's sword ignored him and continued to point in that direction, unwilling to give up. Chu Yang was disturbed by it. He had no choice but to change his route and rush towards the canyon. When he got closer, he was shocked. How is this a canyon? It was clearly a cliff. Clouds and mist filled the air, and it was unknown how deep it was. Not far behind him, a rustling sound could be heard. Suddenly, a voice called out, "Who is it? Stop right there!" Following that, several silhouettes rushed over. Before the silhouettes arrived, several cold lights had already swept across the sky. Their strength was very strong. It seemed that they were the experts of the Golden Horse Riders Department. Chu Yang coldly snorted and rushed back. He knocked down the daggers that were flying towards him. The next moment, Chu Yang's body jumped up. A cold light flashed in his eyes. Then, a sword light scattered into 10,000 cold lights and whizzed out. Calamity Sword, Heaven Sword Technique. First move, 1 cold light pierces 10,000 fathoms. A few short screams were heard. The 3 people who had rushed over were chopped into pieces in an instant. Blood splattered everywhere. These 3 people were very unlucky. The experts of the Golden Horse Riders Department had spread out to search for this Qilong mountain. However, these 3 people were eager to perform meritorious deeds. So, they rushed to the front. They were the first to discover Chu Yang's trace. But they were also the first to lose their lives. However, one of them screamed before he died. And this alarmed the nearby people who were searching for him. A long whistle was heard from afar. Then, a voice shouted, "Over there!" Then, a whooshing sound was heard from all directions. Chu Yang didn't dare to hesitate. He rushed to the edge of the cliff and jumped down. He heard the sound of wind whistling in his ears. The sword tip in his fingers was trembling. Chu Yang tried his best to stabilize his body. He felt that he had fallen 200 or 300 feet. Then, he suddenly stabbed his right hand into the stone wall. He slid down 10 feet and stopped in midair. His body had already entered the clouds and mist. His whole body felt damp. He looked down, but still couldn't see anything. The sword tip was still pointing downwards. "It seems that thing is still down there." He loosened his hand and continued to fall. At the same time, he used his divine sense to explore the ground below him. However, the clouds and mist were everywhere. He couldn't see his position. So, this was the only way. He had fallen 1,000 feet in the blink of an eye. And he was still falling. The sword tip had already calmed down. Then, Chu Yang steeled his heart and continued to fall. He felt that he was falling faster and faster. The sword tip trembled. It seemed to be reminding him of something. Chu Yang stretched out his right hand and stabbed the sword into the stone wall. There was a slight sound. The sword tip slid down the hard stone wall like tofu. It actually slid down for more than 100 feet before stopping in midair. Chu Yang looked down again. There were no more clouds and mist. He could vaguely see a large patch of grass. He was already more than 500 feet below the ground. Chu Yang broke out in a cold sweat. If he had stopped a moment later, wouldn't he have fallen to his death? He was angry at the sword tip. "Are you trying to kill me? Why didn't you say so earlier? The sword tip trembled, excitedly pointing to the ground. Chu Yang was speechless at this guy who only knew about the elixir and didn't know that he was scolding him. He could only take a breath and slide all the way down. Before his body touched the ground, a fragrance came to his face. Chu Yang was shocked. In the next moment, his feet touched the ground. The sword point trembled in excitement. Chu Yang was almost dragged along by the sword point. He arrived at the edge of a small pond. He saw that there was a large open space under a withered pine tree. In the middle of the open space, there were 3 snow-white plants standing alone. Jade Snow Spirit Ginseng? Chu Yang cried out in surprise. Although the Jade Snow Spirit Ginseng wasn't one of the great elixirs, it was still a top-notch treasure. Moreover, there were 3 of them here. Moreover, they had been growing under this cliff for who knows how many years. Looking around, Chu Yang couldn't help but sigh. Not a single blade of grass grew within a few hundred feet. Even the grass outside a few hundred feet looked withered. The trees under the cliff also didn't have much vitality. After so many years of growth, they were only as thick as a bull's mouth. Only the place where the Jade Snow Spirit Ginseng grew was a pine tree that was thicker than a person's arm. But it had already withered into a tree trunk. Where elixirs of heaven and earth grew, they would definitely steal the vitality of all living things in order to grow. This was indeed true. The sword tip was already excitedly stretching and shrinking in his fingers. It couldn't hold back anymore. Chu Yang looked at the sword tip and snorted. He was just about to put his hand on it when the sword's spirit suddenly said, "Don't let it suck." "Why?" Chu Yang hurriedly withdrew his hand. The sword tip stretched and shrank in his hand discontentedly. It looked like a child who had seen something delicious but wasn't allowed to eat it. "These 3 Jade Snow Spirit Ginseng aren't ripe yet," the sword spirit said in his mind. "Put them in the tribulation space first. I will speed up their ripening." "Huh!" Chu Yang was stunned. How many years had it been? Still not ripe? Jade Snow Spirit Ginseng can be used after 500 years. At that time, it's milky white. After 1,000 years, it's considered ripe at 3,000 years. At that time, it's silvery white. But these 3 in front of you have clearly reached the maximum age of 1,000 years. They are already close to pure white. After ripening, if no one uses them, they will scatter into bits of spiritual energy and disappear. The sword spirit said, "These 3 Jade Snow Spirit Ginseng are already close to pure white. They are only a few decades away from reaching their maturity. A fully ripened Jade Snow Spirit Ginseng is comparable to a great elixir. Even if it's used in heavy elixirs, only 1 is needed. If you use it now, it's really too much of a waste." "I see. Then, how long do you need to speed up the ripening of these 3 Jade Snow Spirit Ginseng?" "It should be about 10 days. The sword spirit calculated and reported the time cautiously. Then, as if realizing what Chu Yang was thinking, he said directly, "But don't even think about it. I can't speed up the ripening of just any elixir. Don't even think about ordinary trash. It must be at the level of a great elixir and close to ripening. Otherwise, there's no need to talk about it. Well, even if it's a great elixir, you have to at least get the 5th fragment of the Tribulation Sword before you can use this ripening function without limit." I know. Chu Yang originally planned to collect some elixirs and throw them all in to speed up the ripening process. But after hearing what the sword spirit said, he immediately dismissed the idea. "After ripening, can this elixir help me recover?" "Recover? It's difficult. However, you need a long time to recuperate. 1 Jade Snow Spirit Ginseng is enough for you to recover by more than half. It's useless to take more. As long as you don't have the will to live, you can slowly think of a way to heal your injuries," the sword spirit said. As he spoke, he clearly heaved a sigh of relief. Obviously, these 3 Jade Snow Spirit Ginseng gave him a lot of confidence. Chapter 343. No, but with the addition of these 3 Jade Snow Spirit Ginseng, the quality of the heavy pill will be much better. The reason why the great miracle medicine is the main ingredient of all the medicines in the world is because of this. It is because the great miracle medicine alone is also a heavenly treasure, and it can be compared to any other medicine. Although this jade snow spirit ginseng is also a heavenly treasure, its medicinal properties are still conflicting. Therefore, although it is also a great miracle medicine, it is only different in nature and cannot be compared to the great miracle medicine. So that's how it is. Chu Yang felt grateful. His left hand covered the 3 jade snow spirit ginseng. The next moment, he silently said, "Collect!" And the 3 jade snow spirit ginseng entered the tribulation space. The tribulation sword point was unhappy. With a schwa sound, it emerged from Chu Yang's fingertips. It looked as if it had been wronged to death. It couldn't understand why it didn't have a share in the end. It was the one who found it. It was the one who led the way. It was the one who found it. Chu Yang could only comfort it in his mind. He analyzed the pros and cons. He said a lot of good words. In the end, he promised to give it a complete jade snow spirit ginseng after it ripened. Only then did it dispel Jianen's resentment. Jianen became excited. Chu Yang secretly laughed. He thought, "So what if you enjoyed the jade snow spirit ginseng? Didn't you give me the heavy pill in the end?" Zhu Sha is still so unforgiving. On the cliff, Jing Menghun looked at the 3 tragic corpses in front of him. His face was gloomy. He was surrounded by hundreds of people, and there were still people rushing over. Everyone looked at the 3 corpses and felt their hair stand on end. King-level leader Jing had clearly said that the opponents were seriously injured. However, these 3 people were revered martial artists. From the time they made the noise to the time everyone rushed over, it was only a breath's time. Yet, they were already dead. A person who was fatally injured still had such an attack power? He killed 3 revered martial artists in one move? This is too outrageous, right? The right hand should have a divine weapon that can cut iron like mud. Everyone needs to pay attention during the battle. Jing Menghun stood up and said lightly, "Yes. Looking at the traces, there should be no more than 2 paths. We came from the right. So, the other path is to jump off the cliff. The second path is to the left. We can't go back because our main force is right behind us." Jing Menghun calmly analyzed the situation. Going to the left is risky. But going to the north is the best option. Jumping off the cliff is the safest option. It's also the easiest way to get out of our line of sight. As he said this, he looked at the trail leading to the cliff and said, "You should know that as long as one's cultivation reaches the level of a revered martial artist, one will not die from falling down the cliff, no matter how high the cliff is, as long as one can still circulate their energy. They will be able to safely descend from the cliff." He pondered for a moment and said, "If my guess is not wrong, King of Hell Chu must have jumped off the cliff. What do you think?" Everyone looked at each other, not saying a word. This was the time to make a decision. If anyone interfered now, it would be a definite direction. So, king-level expert Jing would never take the blame if he made a mistake. A group of people, go to the left. I will lead the other team down the cliff. A trace of anger flashed in Jing Menghun's eyes. But he suppressed it. Inform General Wang and General Li. Tell them to transport the hounds as soon as possible. Yes. Everyone move, Jing Menghun ordered. Then, he rushed to the edge of the cliff with his men. Everyone sucked in a breath of cold air as they looked down. Clouds and mist had filled the air, and had sealed the cliff's mouth. They couldn't see anything down there. Everyone was experienced and knowledgeable. Such a phenomenon at the mouth of the cliff could only mean that this cliff was unfathomably high. Previously, everyone had thought that it was just a cliff. They wouldn't die if they jumped down. However, no one dared to say such big words at the moment. The clouds and mist had completely sealed the cliff. So, they couldn't see anything. Who knew what was under their feet? To put it bluntly, even a revered martial artist could fall to the ground if he were to touch a withered branch extending from the cliff's wall and lose his balance. So, It wouldn't be strange if a revered martial artist died on the cliff without the detection ability of a king-level expert's divine sense. The entire process of encircling and suppressing King of Hell Chu had made everyone feel as if they were in a dream. King-level expert Jing had said that Chu Yang was seriously injured and on the verge of death. But Chu Yang was obviously alive and kicking. King-level expert Jing had said that Chu Yang had the fragrance of orchids on his body. However, no one had smelled the fragrance of orchids until now. The most outrageous thing was that King of Hell Chu had cleaned up every place he had passed. Everyone even suspected that this guy didn't need to eat. Didn't he need to urinate or defecate? They hadn't found any trace of King of Hell Chu eating along the way. Nor had they found any trace of King of Hell Chu excreting or defecating. How many days has it been? Is he holding it in? King-level expert Jing had said that King of Hell Chu had jumped to the bottom of the cliff. Everyone was guessing in their hearts. How credible is this statement? How credible is it? We wouldn't mind going down to take a look if the cliff's height was ordinary. But this cliff is so terrifying. Fuck. What if I fall to my death? He thought to himself, my wife and children are waiting for me in the state. I can't die here in a daze. Another thought, I have just married a concubine. I haven't even had the time to enter the bridal chamber. How can I jump off the cliff in a daze? Everyone follow me. Pay attention to your feet. Jing Menghun saw everyone's complexion. How could he not know what these guys were thinking? His complexion sank. He made a prompt decision. He pulled out the Menghun sword and jumped down. He fiercely inserted the Menghun sword into the stone wall at a height of 70 or 80 feet. Simultaneously, he struck the wall with his left hand. Stone fragments swirled in the air, and a small hole appeared in the wall. He went all the way down in this manner. He created a place where he could land his feet. It was as if he was making a staircase. Therefore, the people behind him would come down one by one. They would have no problem as long as they were careful and looked for a place to land. Everyone was overjoyed at this turn of events. It could be said that there was no danger with a king-level expert leading the way. He carefully followed the trail and went down. Chu Yang put away another Ganoderma at the bottom of the cliff. Then, he heard a bang sound from above. He couldn't hear it clearly because it was too far away. However, Chu Yang was already alert in his heart. I've already come down. They don't have any enemies above. So, why are they making such a noise? Then, there was another sound, and another sound. Chu Yang quickly judged, they are making a staircase. They are coming down. Chu Yang didn't even think about it. He immediately turned around and flew towards the other side. As for burying them below, Chu Yang didn't plan to do so. I can only use half of my strength at the moment. But the opposite party can make a staircase from such a steep cliff. So, there must be a king-level expert among them. Perhaps, Jing Menghun is personally leading the team. So, I would be courting death if I ambushed them. Chu Yang flew all the way. He didn't even look back. Jing Menghun and the others carefully went down to the bottom of the cliff to search. But Chu Yang had already escaped. Chu Yang was already more than a dozen miles away from the north. The buffer of this cliff had given Chu Yang precious time. He had wasted a lot of time to break through the mountain pass. Moreover, he had wasted a lot of time to look for the elixir. So, he had wasted a lot of time. However, his good luck had come to an end. The orchid fragrance in his blood couldn't be suppressed any longer. It began to faintly float out. This orchid fragrance was like a maggot in Chu Yang's tarsal bone. It was his biggest crisis. Unexpectedly, there was a canyon in front of him. There were towering mountain peaks on both sides. And there was 100-feet wide canyon between them. A team of Great Zhao's army was slowly advancing in a fan-shaped formation on the opposite side of the slanted canyon. The entire canyon was filled with troops. There was no blind spot. Chu Yang was hiding in a big tree far away. He frowned. I must kill my way out of here if I want to pass through. He looked at the towering mountain peaks on both sides. Half of the mountain peaks were covered with clouds and mist. He couldn't see the top. It would take at least 2 days to pass through if he took a detour. Moreover, I don't know how many traps the opposite party can arrange in these 2 days. I can't afford to waste even half a day's time. I won't be able to return to Iron Cloud for the rest of my life even if I slow down for an hour. Chu Yang was very clear about this. The Golden Horse Riders Department has always been led by the nose. They can only chase after me from behind. The Golden Horse Riders Department will be 100 times more dangerous than chasing after me if they catch up with me. And this 10,000-man army is here to obstruct me. Jing Menghun isn't stupid. He won't expect an ordinary army to catch me. These troops won't be able to find me if I hide in this mountainous forest. The main reason why the army has come is to intercept me here. Chu Yang instantly understood the enemy's strategy. The bugle horn sounded at this time. The enemy troops stopped and began to pitch camp. It seemed that they were going to set up camp in this canyon. Chu Yang looked at them attentively. He couldn't help but feel cold in his heart. This troop is well trained. They must be experienced soldiers. Moreover, the commander of this troop must be a famous general. This is the only way to return home. I'm afraid that I will fall into the hands of the Golden Horse Riders Department no matter what I do. How can I fight a 10,000-man army by myself? Detour. Chu Yang was sure that he would encounter the main force of the Golden Horse Riders Department if he detoured. The enemy isn't far from me. So, I will be attacked from both the front and the back. Jing Menghun will catch up with me if I don't move. Then I will have no way out. My only chance is to take advantage of the time when the enemy is setting up camp. Then I will break through. Chu Yang's eyes suddenly became sharp. I won't change my mind since I've made up my mind. I only need to make the necessary preparations. Sword Spirit! Chu Yang shouted in his mind. What's the matter? Sword Spirit appeared. Chapter 344. Sword Spirit didn't speak. It seemed that he was observing. Then, he said after a long while, "It's too risky." "Risky? Then, let's do it." Chu Yang made up his mind. Sword Spirit didn't say that he couldn't withstand it. He only said that it was somewhat risky. Since it was risky, it meant that there was a chance of success. At this moment, Chu Yang would risk everything as long as there was even a 1% chance. Moreover, Sword Spirit had said that he could take the risk. Chu Yang took a deep breath. He slowly stretched out his right hand. A sword appeared in his hand with a clang. If I succeed in this attack, I'll be able to escape from this predicament. If I fail, this will be the last battle of my life. I have to fight with my back to the river. I must go all out, regardless of life or death. Chu Yang didn't think about anything at this moment. He didn't think about Meng Chao Ran, Tan Tan, or his brothers. He also didn't think about his ethereal origin. There was only one thought in his mind: kill. 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 Go. Go. One ray of cold light pierces 10,000 fathoms. What harm is there in slaughtering the entire world? Chu Yang slowly recited in a low voice. His eyes were fixed on the shining sword. He murmured repeatedly, "What harm is there in slaughtering the entire world?" A surge of heroic spirit suddenly rose in Chu Yang's heart as he recited this calamity sword formula. The most crucial part of this calamity sword formula was the question mark at the end. This question mark was indeed a choice. It was a choice between two completely different paths for a person who practiced the heavenly sword technique. One was hesitation, and the other was decisiveness. What harm is there in doing so? What harm is there in doing so? What harm is there in doing so? Let me slaughter the entire world. Chu Yang felt a surge of energy in his chest. A raging ruthlessness rushed up from the bottom of his heart. He raised his eyebrows. His cold gaze passed through the forest, and shot towards the army that was setting up camp in the distance. He said gloomily and coldly, "What harm is there in doing so? What harm is there in doing so?" The sword flashed as if it had sensed a murderous aura on its master's body. A clang sound was heard, and the cold sword light flipped. The Calamity Sword's tip climbed up the sword's body with an incomparable sharpness. The tip of the sword flashed with a dazzling light. This light was far more intense than sunlight. Clang! Jian silently rushed out of his dantian, and went against the flow of his meridians. It rushed into his arm, and rushed to his palm. Chu Yang felt a surge of heat in his entire body. The long sword in his hand lit up, and a greenish-white light flashed with a hint of blood red. Then, the sword blade rushed up. Boom! Suddenly, a murderous aura filled the sky and spread out. In an instant, the area in front of and behind Chu Yang's body had almost turned into a netherworld. It was filled with a gloomy and chilling hell-like aura. The birds on the trees and the ants on the ground all fled in panic when they sensed the terrifying killing intent. The first 3 parts of the Calamity Sword were all fierce blades that charged and broke through enemy lines. This was the first time they had worked together after 10,000 years. The 3 parts of the sword with the strongest killing intent were put together. In the past 80,000 years, the first 8 Calamity Swords had appeared in the world. Each time, they had their own order and were completely different. However, there had never been a time when the sword tip, sword edge, and sword blade appeared in the first 3 segments. Only this time, Chu Yang had directly come out to kill. Corresponding to the tragic phenomenon in this chaotic world, it seemed to indicate something. Perhaps, this was the will of the heavens? With the sword in his hand, a murderous aura suddenly rushed up from Chu Yang's heart. It was a kind of murderous aura between heaven and earth. In the past 80,000 years, who knew how many souls had been transcended by the sword tip, sword brocade, and sword edge of the Calamity Sword? And the Calamity Sword had always been a divine weapon that ruled over the heavens. It had only started to move unhindered in the upper 3 heavens. How could anyone who could die under the Calamity Sword be simple? To put it bluntly, in Chu Yang's eyes, king-level martial artists were probably experts. However, in terms of the souls that died under the Calamity Sword, king-level martial artists probably couldn't even be considered as the weakest. Not to mention emperor-level martial artists, even monarch-level martial artists, and saint-level martial artists would probably die under the Calamity Sword. As for supreme martial artists, no one dared to say that there weren't any. Now, Chu Yang let the 3 parts of the Calamity Sword, this kind of murderous weapon, directly collide with each other. The murderous aura that erupted was almost enough to destroy Chu Yang's brain. Thanks to Chu Yang's 2 lifetimes, his huge spiritual power, and the suppression of the sword spirit, he was able to successfully control this murderous aura that belonged to the Calamity Sword. However, Chu Yang's current cold and hard appearance was no different from that of a ferocious demon in the legends. Everyone who saw him wouldn't pay attention to his appearance. Instead, they would pay attention to the murderous aura on his body, which had already formed a solid substance. However, there was one thing that Chu Yang had overlooked. The Calamity Sword now had a new function because it had obtained the 3rd part. It could absorb the power of living beings. Chu Yang closed his eyes and took 2 deep breaths. Then, he suddenly opened his eyes. His body silently floated out, and went along some hidden corners. He relied on the cover of the forest's big trees, and stuck close to the ground in the grass. Wherever he went, it was as if a boat was passing through the water surface. The green grass rippled with a schwa sound, and a ripple appeared on both sides. Then, the ripple immediately returned to normal. The general leading the troops was Great Zhao's famous general, Wang Tinglong. He had received orders from Diwu Qingro to gather 200,000 troops in the shortest time possible. Then, he would turn north and rush to the battlefield of Iron Cloud. However, he hadn't expected that he would be intercepted by the Invisible Mound as soon as he left the province with his personal guards. He was ordered to turn back and help kill King of Hell Chu. This matter was extremely urgent. Wang Tinglong didn't have enough time to transfer troops from other places. So, he had no choice but to use his 10,000 personal guards. Moreover, he was full of confidence. I have 10,000 elite troops. Even the cooks are elites who have survived hundreds of battles. Such a troop of 10,000 won't fall into a disadvantageous position even in the face of an army of 100,000. In fact, it's very likely that we'll win the battle, and even annihilate the enemy. It should be enough to besiege King of Hell Chu. Wang Tenglong didn't dare to underestimate this legendary King of Hell Chu in his heart. 10,000 troops besieging King of Hell Chu was only enough in his heart. He wasn't using a sledgehammer to kill a chicken with a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Wang Tenglong was a famous general of Great Zhao. He always had more than 100,000 troops under his command. He was ranked 13th in the list of famous generals of the continent. He was tough, intrepid, and had a fiery temperament. He wasn't an easy general to deal with. An ordinary deputy general didn't have more than a few hundred personal guards. An ordinary general didn't have more than 1,000 personal guards. Even a senior general couldn't have more than 3,000. Only a commander-level general had the qualifications to have 10,000 personal guards. This showed how terrifying Wang Tenglong was. Moreover, Wang Tenglong's 10,000 personal guards were the elite of the elite. Wang Tenglong immediately arranged his troops as soon as he saw the terrain of this canyon. They will advance in a fan-shaped formation and set up camp in the narrowest part of the canyon. This place is like the throat of a giant. Even a fly won't be able to fly past this throat as long as I grab it. Wang Tenglong was 100% sure that his troops would be able to hold out for a month as long as they set up camp here. Even if the enemy were to send a 1,000,000-strong army to attack, it wouldn't be a problem as long as I have enough provisions to support it. They had already reached the narrowest part of the canyon. So, the deputy general had arranged for them to set up camp. Wang Tenglong urged his horse to go to a small slope, and raised his eyes to look for any movement in the mountain forest. The entire boundless mountain forest was like a huge gourd. And this canyon was the stem of the gourd. Nobody would be able to escape his surveillance, as long as they came out of the mountain forest. However, Wang Tenglong was absolutely certain that he hadn't let out even a single one of his beasts during the entire journey to outflank them. In other words, King of Hell Chu Fei hadn't taken this route back to Iron Cloud. He must have stayed in Great Zhao, and must have gone to Limitless Continent. Otherwise, he wouldn't have left this mountain forest. As long as he's here, as long as he dares to come, he must have come for me. Reporting to the Great General, the military order has been issued. The deputy general turned around and ran to Wang Tenglong's side. He then stood at attention and reported to him. This was Wang Tenglong's rule. Even his closest deputy general wasn't allowed to disobey. Otherwise, he would be punished according to military law. He believed that an army should act like an army. Even if he was a father or a brother, he should act like a soldier in the army. You're my father. But my military rank is higher than yours. So, you have to stand at attention and salute me when you see me. Moreover, you can only call me Great General. You're not allowed to call me anything else. I'll beat you if you dare to call me son in front of so many generals. Wang Tenglong's son was the Great General, and he was the Deputy General. But he would still bow and kowtow when he saw his son in the barracks. This was the military law. There was a time when his younger brother was a general under his command. He had unconsciously called him Big Brother when he saw him. So, Wang Tenglong ordered his subordinates to beat him 40 times. Wang Tenglong would rather cry in front of his younger brother's bed at night. But he was the great general in the army's tent. He was impartial and impartial. Even Di Wuqing Ro could only call him by his military rank when he came to the great general's tent. This was Wang Tenglong. Wang Tenglong indifferently glanced at the busy army. He then said with a straight face, "Ah, I know." He paused for a moment and then said, "Fu Hu, what do you think will happen this time?" Deputy General Sun Fu, who had been his partner for more than 10 years. They had a tacit understanding between them. They didn't need to speak. In fact, they didn't need to speak to each other. So Sun Fu Hu knew what Wang Tenglong was thinking just by listening to his words. Sun Fu Hu cautiously looked at the mountain forest. Then, he looked at the army and solemnly said, "Reporting to the Great General, I think that King of Hell Chu won't be able to escape with the Great General here, Not necessarily. Wan Tenglong smiled and slowly shook his head. He was still gazing at the mountain forest as he insipidly said, "You don't understand King of Hell Chu. King of Hell Chu wouldn't be King of Hell Chu if I could catch him so easily." Chapter 345. What? Sun Fu, who was startled. King of Hell Chu was seriously injured. His 5 internal organs were shattered. Did you see it with your own eyes? Wan Tenglong asked with a cold look in his eyes. I didn't see it. Bifu Hu stuck out his chest and replied loudly. You didn't see it? How can you say that he was seriously injured? Wan Tenglong's expression was very serious. This? Sun Fu, who was at a loss. The Golden Horse Riders Department had announced this news to the world. It had been approved by Prime Minister Diwu. How could it not be regarded as conclusive news? Don't believe any news without seeing it with your own eyes, Wan Tenglong sternly said. We are soldiers. We are generals. We must pay attention to evidence. We must verify things that we haven't seen with our own eyes, even if the whole world is talking about it. Otherwise, we will be defeated by our own gullibility. Men of Jiang who can flee far away if they are defeated. It's not too late to take revenge even after 10 years. Politicians can endure when they are defeated. They can hide their strength and bide their time. Then they can rise again. But soldiers and generals can pile up like mountains when they are defeated. Their blood will flow like a sea. They will suffer a crushing defeat. They will be consigned to eternal damnation, Wan Tenglong sternly said. Many of our brothers will be buried on the battlefield if we are defeated. You may have the opportunity to turn defeat into victory. But the brothers who died today will never come back. We don't have so many brothers for us to spoil. Do you understand? Wan Tenglong coldly shouted. Yes. Bifu, who was drenched in cold sweat. He stood upright. He felt that his back was drenched in cold sweat. I won't let you command an army alone if you still have such thoughts, Wan Tenglong insipidly said. Yes. I don't dare. Bifu, who was drenched in sweat this time. Pass down my orders. Set up camp faster. Set up pots and cook rice faster. Within 15 minutes we must set up the camp and set up the iron pots to cook. Within 30 minutes, everyone must finish eating. Wan Tenglong turned his head to look at the chaotic troops. He frowned and said, Everyone must eat until they are full in half an hour. Even if they have to eat raw rice. Wan Tenglong's eyes contained a hint of worry. He looked at the mountain forest on the opposite side and muttered, This is our only chance if something goes wrong. And King of Hell Chu breaks through my defenses. The consequences will be unimaginable if he catches us. Yes. Although Bifu didn't agree with his decision, he didn't dare to say anything and immediately went to pass down the order. Finishing the meal in half an hour seemed like a long time. However, this was a place of rapid march. They had just arrived here and were tired and had no time to rest. Everyone had to work together and set up camp first. All of this required time. After setting up camp, they would start cooking according to the location of each camp. Start a fire, add more people, cook the rice and eat it. Eat. Half an hour was definitely not enough. Even the fastest of them could only eat until they were half full. It seemed that the army would have to eat half-cooked rice for this meal. Sun Fu sighed and ran off to give the order. He couldn't understand. Is it worth it to torment the army like this just for King of Hell Chu? Was it necessary? He was dissatisfied. However, Wan Tenglong was also somewhat anxious. His eyes stared unblinkingly at the forest opposite him, and the sense of crisis in his heart grew heavier and heavier. This is King of Hell Chu's only chance to break through. That's because everyone is busy here. Wan Tenglong was certain that King of Hell Chu would be a god if he missed this opportunity. He would never be able to pass through here. Therefore, he was impatient. He was worried that King of Hell Chu wouldn't seize this opportunity. The best and most ideal news for Wan Tenglong at the moment was that the camp had been set up, and the troops had eaten. So, they were conserving their strength for the big push. He wished that he could take the time away. He had never been so nervous since he had joined the army. It's because the world-defying heavens welcomes you. He knows the importance of King of Hell Chu. King of Hell Chu's life or death is related to the overall situation of this war. Smoke gradually rose from the kitchen of the army camp. The soldiers had received the order. They knew that time was of the essence. So, they impatiently moved into action. These fellows were all veteran ruffians. Normally, each of them would be indolent and lazy. Even when they walked, they would be weak and slack. However, when the time came, each of them would be able to pull themselves out and show their strength. Their usual laziness was the result of their indifference after seeing life and death. But they had a different mental appearance now that they had moved into action. Perhaps it's not too late. Wang Tunglong heaved a sigh of relief. He immediately issued an order, and ordered his personal guards to move to the front of the troops. There were only 300 personal guards. But all of them were experts. Even the weakest among them were martial warriors. In fact, there were several martial great masters and one revered martial artist among them. These forces were unremarkable. But one mustn't forget that this was an ordinary army. An ordinary army could have such people. But the commander must have extraordinary charisma. Otherwise, these people would have been willing to serve as ordinary soldiers. His personal guards ran out. They hadn't finished lining up in formation yet. Wang Tunglong had been looking at the distant mountains. But his complexion suddenly changed. He waved his hand and loudly shouted, "Enemy attack! The enemy has broken into the camp. Everyone, be on guard." His face had turned red. He had shouted himself hoarse. His throat had suddenly burst with such a strong volume that it seemed as if he would spurt out blood. The well-trained army reacted at the same time. The bugle horn sounded in unison. The soldiers who were busy grasping their weapons immediately grasped them. However, Wang Tunglong's heart had become powerless at this time. He had clearly seen a bird fly up from the top of the mountain a moment ago. It seemed as if there had been a little movement. He was about to take a closer look. But it had become tranquil again. He was still wondering whether this was the movement of a beast or a human. But then, he saw a wave of movement in the grass 1,000 feet away from the front of the troops. Then, at this moment, he cried out. But by the time his voice had left his mouth, a figure had already rushed over like a bolt of lightning, carrying with it a boundless murderous aura. In the next moment, only a blurry figure could be seen. This person had already used a crazy posture to brazenly crash into the formation of 10,000 people. A low and deep voice filled with murderous aura echoed. "One ray of cold light pierces 10,000 fathoms." The sword light broke through the obstruction of the Milky Way like 1,000 waterfalls. And it flowed out like a torrential downpour. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream resounded in the clear sky. It seemed as if a murderous aura had condensed into a substance. And it swept through the entire canyon. Wang Tunglong closed his eyes in pain. The aroma of the meal had just begun to spread. It was also the time when the troops were the most relaxed after a long and difficult journey. They had set up camp and were only waiting to eat. Many people had picked up their rice bowls and were waiting by the side of the big pot. They were pushing and shoving each other. Some people were even cursing. Time was very tight. Being able to grab the first bowl of rice would determine whether they would be able to eat their fill or not. Therefore, the entire army was in a mess. The army couldn't withstand a single blow at this time. It didn't matter how elite the troops were. King of Hell Chu was so far away. So, how could he accurately grasp the most vulnerable moment of the army? Wang Tunglong was puzzled. But he still made the right decision. Send an order to the rear troops to meet the enemy. The enemy had already broken through the front troops. The rear troops could only block the enemy for a while. The rear troops couldn't stop the enemy's speed. The only hope they had was the rear troops, who were holding the line at the moment. Wang Tunglong's anxious chest was on fire. I only need a moment. No, I only need a blink of an eye. I only need to give my troops such a short time to react. and they will be able to form a fighting force in this chaotic situation. But will King of Hell Chu give me such a short time? The answer is yes. He won't. Chu Yang had been dormant all this time. He had waited until now to make his move because he was waiting for a fleeting opportunity. Therefore, he had immediately flown out when he had seen the smoke rise for 3/4 of an hour. That was because the aroma of the meal had just started to spread. This army had traveled a long and difficult journey. So, they must be tired and hungry. The aroma of the meal had spread, and had fallen into the nostrils of these tired and hungry soldiers. This was the smell of heaven. Everyone's heart was filled with a genuine desire for food at this moment. When the food was really cooked, this desire would fall back. Chu Yang had experienced this feeling countless times in his previous life. Therefore, he clearly understood it. Therefore, he had chosen this time to set out and break through the defensive line of this famous general. This general's defensive line hadn't been formed yet. So, it would be unfair even if he defeated him. However, Chu Yang could only take advantage of this situation. He had used the tribulation's art of concealment at lightning speed. He had rushed across the 1,000 feet grassland until he had arrived in front of the army. Then, the grass behind him had started to ripple, and had started to show traces of someone flying past. This kind of speed was truly shocking. Even Chu Yang himself had been startled. Even he himself had never thought that the 3 sections of the Calamity Sword would be so powerful when combined with the Baidu world-defying stage bar. 1 ray of cold light pierces 10,000 fathoms. Issued. Dozens of people couldn't dodge in time. They screamed miserably. Their bodies spun as they were flung out. Blood flowed out of their bodies as they flew in the air. The moment Chu Yang rushed past them, their complete bodies turned into gunny sack after gunny sack and were torn to pieces. Chu Yang's body didn't stop. He rushed forward like a violent whirlwind. His face was cold and cruel. There was no pity in his eyes. The sword spirit in Chu Yang's mind smiled and muttered to himself. This time, 1 ray of cold light pierces 10,000 fathoms. Finally has a little bit of the real 1 ray of cold light pierces 10,000 fathoms. Chu Yang felt a slight vibration in the palm of his hand as he killed a lot of soldiers. Then, a wisp of hot air flowed through his palm and into his body. He suddenly felt a surge of energy. Chu Yang's heart skipped a beat. He suddenly remembered what the sword spirit had said when he had just obtained the 3rd section of Tribulation's sword. Chapter 346. Chu Yang felt that his body was brimming with energy as he felt the heat from Siyi's body. It seemed as if he wouldn't feel tired at all. He was delighted as he thought, is this the power of devouring living beings? However, his hands did not stop moving. He unsheathed his long sword and soared into the sky. Facing the arrogant soldiers and valiant generals who did not care about their lives, he sternly shouted, "What harm is there in slaughtering the entire world? Proud of the heavens, welcome!" A round beam of light suddenly appeared as he unsheathed his calamity sword. It looked like a frightening dragon. It drew a bright spray of blood in the crowd as it surged forward. Boundless murderous aura suddenly pervaded the entire battlefield. Heads rolled and soared into the sky. Severed arms were thrown into the air. Some of them were even tightly holding shiny swords. Blue veins popped out on the fingers of those severed arms that were holding swords. But they had already left their owners' bodies. Chu Yang's body advanced another 100 feet. Then, he finally landed from the sky. He stepped on the fresh corpses on the ground. His whole body was covered in blood. It seemed as if he was taking a shower of blood. He madly rushed forward step by step. These elite troops that had been moving unhindered on the battlefield didn't stand a chance against his cruel killing moves and the sharpness of his calamity sword. Chu Yang didn't say a word. He buried his head and madly rushed forward. Kill! In such a state of battle, Chu Yang suddenly had a feeling, as long as my legs aren't chopped off, I will be able to rush out like this. There was absolutely no suspense. That was because he didn't only have enough real energy to use. Moreover, Sword Spirit was constantly replenishing his spiritual energy to ensure that the real energy in his dantian was maintained at the same level as before it was consumed. This was the internal circulation. It could guarantee that he wouldn't have any second thoughts. And now, the weakest link was the external circulation. That was his physical strength. The Calamity Sword was constantly absorbing the energy from the people it had killed. It was pouring into his body. He wouldn't feel the slightest bit tired. No one in the Chongtian continent could compare with Chu Yang in these two aspects. Chu Yang was like a monstrous wave. But, after dealing with this monstrous wave, he still had an entire ocean behind him to support him in launching the next wave of attacks. How could such a person be stopped? This is King of Hell Chu? Wang Tenglong stood on the short slope. He was sucking in a mouthful of cold air. He had overestimated King of Hell Chu's terror as much as possible before he had arrived here. But he had to admit that he had underestimated this man after seeing the scene before his eyes. As expected, he's the King Yenluo of Hell. Wang Tenglong looked at his subordinates being chopped like vegetables. His heart felt as if it was frying oil. The other party was clearly only one person, but he had created a scene that was even more tragic than a battle between thousands of soldiers and horses. That kind of wild aura that swallowed 10,000 miles, that kind of domineering aura that looked disdainfully at the heavens and earth, made people tremble in fear when they saw it. Fortunately, his rear troops had managed to gain the time of a breath and were already in formation. Their valiant faces were filled with heaviness as they held on tightly to their formation. It was obvious that they weren't sure if they could successfully stop King of Hell Chu. Cut off his legs first! Wang Tenglong snatched the bugle horn from the soldier next to him. He threw it on the ground and bellowed. Pass down my order! Chop off his legs first! Wang Tenglong was a seasoned great general. So, he had formulated the best strategy almost immediately. 30 messengers stood in a row. They then raised their voices and shouted. The great general has ordered, chop off his legs first. The great general has ordered, chop off his legs first. Their voices grew louder and louder. Almost half of the people on the battlefield heard them. They then shouted in unison. The great general has ordered, chop off his legs first. Yes, sir. In the distant army, more than 4,000 men shouted in agreement at the same time. Their pupils shrunk as they stared at the demon-like black figure that was charging towards their army at an increasing speed. Everyone's palms were drenched in cold sweat. A violent, murderous aura slowly rose in Chu Yang's heart as he fought. This murderous aura rose, and his eyes slowly turned red. The power of the sword in his hand also increased by 30% in the instant this murderous aura rushed up. He brandished his sword to the left, and 3 soldiers screamed as they retreated. He brandished his sword to the right, and 4 heads flew in the air. He brandished his sword to the front, and left a trail of blood for 50 feet. Then, he rushed forward in big strides. His feet moved like a whirlwind, and people could only see a group of shadows. Blood splashed everywhere as he stamped his foot. The long sabers were like a forest, and they were aimed at his lower body. The murderous aura in Chu Yang's heart grew more and more intense. Suddenly, he let out a long shout and a long laugh. His body miraculously rose high into the air, and flew forward at a high speed. He left a trail of blood wherever he went. Suddenly, a voice full of murderous aura was heard. The bones in my palm are as high as a mountain. With a flip of his body, his long sword drew a brilliant arc in the air. It was expanding outwards, but its speed was extremely fast. A group of people fell to the ground in an orderly fashion. Chu Yang laughed loudly and recited, A pool of blood under the sword surges like waves. Another sharp sword cry was heard. The Calamity Sword emitted a sword light that represented death. The sword light fell like rain. Chu Yang's body flew out 70 feet like a dragon. It was as if he had gone mad. He laughed wildly and tragically. The world of mortals is the path of ruthlessness. The Calamity Sword hovered in the army formation. Chu Yang somersaulted in the air again, and avoided the torrential rain of arrows. he then said fiercely. I won't retract my saber when I kill the world. Chu Yang's body moved forward amidst the surging waves of blood along with a long laugh. He was like a hurricane. Wang Tung long felt powerless in the distance. He muttered, The bones in my palm are as high as a mountain. The blood pool under my sword is like rolling waves. The world of mortals is the path of ruthlessness. I won't retract my saber when I kill the world. A demon! He's not a human. He's a demon! Blood splattered everywhere. Chu Yang was madly rushing forward. He was unscrupulously killing. He hadn't killed to his heart's content for a long time since he had massacred the big clan that had ambushed Mo Ching Wu in his previous life. Coupled with the tens of thousands of years of accumulated hostility of the Calamity Sword, Chu Yang was now blindly killing. Charge! But in such a crazy state, Chu Yang had miraculously comprehended 4 sword moves on his own. Using the sword as a saber. Using the saber as a sword. The bones in my palm are as high as a mountain. The blood pool under my sword is like rolling waves. The world of mortals is the path of ruthlessness. I won't retract my saber when I kill the world. These 4 moves were definitely not part of the Calamity Sword. But they were also 4 moves. They were not inferior to the 4 moves of the Heaven Sword technique. These 4 moves were full of ruthlessness. After the last move was launched, Chu Yang's heart suddenly became clear and bright. The ruthlessness that filled his mind disappeared in an instant. He could clearly feel that his senses had become more sensitive. His reactions had become faster and more accurate. His movements had become smoother and more powerful. His judgments had become more timely and more accurate. In the center of the siege of dozens of people, he could clearly determine which of the 4 sabers that seemed to be coming at him at the same time was the fastest, which was the most threatening, and which looked fierce but had no killing power. If Chu Yang was allowed to show off his skills at this moment, he could even use his sword to block and defeat all the attacks in an orderly manner. This was definitely not an illusion. It was absolute certainty. His 5 internal organs were still sealed by the sword's spirit. In other words, it was impossible for his martial power to increase. Then, the only possibility was that his spiritual sense had broken through. In other words, his realm had broken through. At this critical juncture, he had unexpectedly made a breakthrough for himself. But Chu Yang didn't know that his breakthrough this time had been happening for a long time. The first sign happened when Chu Yang crossed Wu Qing Ro's legacy prime minister residence on a stormy night. The fusion of martial power at that moment caused Chu Yang's vital energy, which came from different stages and places, to completely fuse. Chu Yang's nerves were in a state of high tension during the time he was on the run. He didn't even dare to relax during the short sleep of less than half an hour every day. Every time he escaped, it was easy. Every time he took a risk, it was a test. And it was important to note that all of this happened when his internal organs were almost broken beyond repair. In other words, the pressure to complete all of this was borne by his mind. He couldn't be confused at all. Just a moment ago, he decided to let go of all his worries and threw himself into the battlefield with all his might. When he was fighting, his nerves and spirit had completely transformed from a mess to a piece of steel. Then, the combination of the 3 most murderous parts of the Calamity Sword had an unparalleled impact on Chu Yang. It made Chu Yang unknowingly enter a violent state of slaughter. But it was in this state of slaughter that Chu Yang had never entered before that he was able to vent all of the tyrannical emotions in his 2 lives. It was at this moment when these negative emotions flowed out along with the murderous aura that Chu Yang suddenly fell into a state of epiphany similar to becoming a Buddha on the spot. This kind of epiphany made him follow his state of mind without thinking at all. He used the method that made him feel the most comfortable, venting, and delightful. He swung his first sword. The corpse in his palm was as tall as a mountain. But after this move, he felt that it wasn't enough. After all, this was a palm. Although Chu Yang's mind was still in the state of epiphany provided by Baidu world-defying heavens, he could subconsciously think that he was using a sword. Therefore, under such circumstances, the tyrannical next move appeared, blood waves churning waves under the sword. But the extreme bloodiness of these two moves evoked some emotions in Chu Yang's heart. The world of mortals is ruthless. The way of heaven is ruthless. But my mission in this life is to go against the way of heaven. So, in such a state of emptiness, Chu Yang only remembered his most primitive mission in this life: go against heaven and change fate, and save Qing Wu. So, with boundless resentment, he swung his third move: the world of mortals is ruthless. Chapter 347. But then, Chu Yang was stimulated by this boundless hatred. Finally, in this strange state, he created his fourth move, which was also the most powerful and the last move with endless charm: don't retract my saber after killing the whole world. This move represented Chu Yang's state of mind: even if I kill the whole world, I won't sheath my sword if I don't achieve my goal. I won't give up. Don't retract my saber. Therefore, this move had become Chu Yang's strongest obsession, and it was also the most perfect move. And with endless desire, it created the charm of this move, which was destined to become a classic. This move was a step further than the second move of Calamity Sword: what harm is there in slaughtering the whole world? This move also represented a complete breakthrough in Chu Yang's state of mind. From then on, Chu Yang's martial path truly broke away from the scope of Calamity Sword. It became his own unique comprehension. A tool is a tool. A divine weapon is also a tool. And I'm a human. When Chu Yang woke up from his state of mind, he clearly felt that the three parts of Calamity Sword had really merged into one under his powerful pressure. And it had merged into his body. This was the complete submission of Calamity Sword to its master. In his mind, the sword's spirit sighed deeply and powerlessly. The current Chu Yang had already jumped out of the cycle of Calamity Sword. I really don't know what this freak will do to this heavenly layer. He could also have such a strange breakthrough in such a time and place. Chu Yang let out a long roar. Cold light shot out from Calamity Sword. He stepped in the void and moved 10 feet in one step. Blades and spears were like a forest under his feet. Arrows were like rain in front of him. But Chu Yang ignored them. Under the support of this strange state of mind, he moved forward rapidly. Under his feet, whoever's head was touched by his toes, that person's head would immediately explode strangely. Chu Yang stepped on the blood of corpses and rushed forward. Behind him, corpses would fall down with a series of popping sounds. At this time, the commander's flag had been raised on the high slope. The flag bearers at the side waved the flag crazily and signaled, "I'd rather die than let him leave." The troops at the front all turned around and stepped on the corpses of their comrades to counterattack crazily. There was no strategy. They were fighting with their lives. The only way for ordinary soldiers to deal with an expert like Chu Yang was to sacrifice themselves. Using human lives, the lives of hundreds and thousands of people, in exchange for his life. In front of Chu Yang, there was an open space. It was hundreds of feet wide. Hundreds of feet away, the rear troops were lined up neatly. Sabers were unsheathed, arrows were nocked, and men were on the ground. Wang Tinglong stood upright like a pine tree on the high slope. His complexion was cold and stiff. His eyes were fixated on Chu Yang's figure. He was constantly making hand signals. The flag signals were constantly changing along with his hand signals. And the neat formation of the rear army was also changing along with the flag signals. They were constantly blocking Chu Yang's path of advance. Wang Tinglong looked at King of Hell Chu with his sharp eyes. His complexion was cold and emotionless. He had seen too many scenes like this. How many famous generals had the ability to charge into an army all by themselves? Wang Tinglong had done his best to arrange this defensive line to the best of his ability. So, he had made the changes in the battle formation more reasonable. It's King of Hell Chu's fate if he dies here. It would be his fate if King of Hell Chu were to break out of the encirclement and escape. It's not that I didn't command well. I'm only doing my job to the best of my ability. That's all. Chu Yang didn't stop. He was crazily rushing all the way. Everything before his eyes turned dark. Several figures pounced on him from the front, back, left, and right. They opened their big mouths ferociously, and roared. Then, they used their bodies to welcome Chu Yang's sword. Then, they ferociously crashed into him. Countless people pounced on him as soon as these people started to move. Human wave tactic. The people who were pouncing on him were doomed to die. But their deaths could create a huge obstacle for the enemy. At the very least, those 100 kilograms of flesh were pounding on the enemy's body. Moreover, they were entangling the enemy's life force. They didn't hesitate to pay any price to keep the enemy here. An ordinary king-level expert would have died under such a crazy attack if he had been in their place. However, Chu Yang was different. That's because Chu Yang's calamity sword had the strange ability to devour the life force. These soldiers were desperately pouncing on him. So, they would only give him endless power. But they wouldn't pose any threat to him. Perhaps, they would obstruct him. But it wouldn't be serious. Dozens of silhouettes swooped down from the sky, and pressed down on Chu Yang's entire body. They formed a mountain of flesh. All the soldiers at the side roared in grief and indignation. They raised their swords and sabers and slashed at the mountain of flesh. This was the only way to deal with such an expert. They would chop the enemy and the people who were entangled with him into minced meat. Then, they would eliminate him completely. Otherwise, once he escaped from this mountain of flesh, he would have a place to move. No matter how many people there were, they wouldn't be able to kill him. They had experienced this many times before. It wasn't the first time they had killed a strong expert. Although they were sad and indignant, there was no other way. It had been proven that this method was absolutely effective. But today, it might not be so. Hundreds of sabers fell at the same time. Suddenly, a burst of sword light flashed in front of everyone. That mountain of flesh disintegrated in an instant, and a bright sword light rushed out from inside. With a crashing sound, the circle of sabers broke into pieces. Chu Yang's blood-red figure roared angrily, and turned into a bolt of lightning, and rushed out. In such a cruel battle, Chu Yang's fighting direction had never changed. He kept going north. Sword lights flew out one after another, and blood, flesh, heads, and limbs flew up into the air. It had always been a single ray of cold light pierces 10,000 fathoms. Chu Yang realized that this move was simply tailor-made to deal with group attacks. Therefore, after his epiphany, he didn't use any other sword moves. He only used the first move repeatedly. He skillfully used it. His feet didn't stop moving. He didn't know how many times he had used it. Suddenly, his body felt light. He had escaped from the encirclement. He had arrived at a spacious area. Chu Yang didn't hesitate. His body moved in a strange zigzagging curve. He continued to rush forward. The moment he escaped from the encirclement, a bugle horn sounded. All of a sudden, the sky turned pitch black. Chu Yang looked up. He saw that the army in front of him that hadn't moved. They raised their hands in an orderly manner. Countless spears flew towards him in waves. At the same time, the archers also moved. There were dozens of siege crossbows shooting towards him. Behind him, all the soldiers stopped in their tracks at the same time and threw their javelins at him. For a moment, the sky was covered. Tens of thousands of arrows, thousands of spears, and the powerful siege crossbows were all aimed at him. "Be careful!" the sword spirit reminded. Chu Yang had already let out a loud shout. His body swayed, and he dashed out diagonally to the right. Sticking close to the ground, he flew out swiftly like a piece of white paper. The calamity sword transformed into a sword light in front of him, shooting down all the arrows that were coming at him. Boom! A deafening explosion resounded. A total of 8 siege crossbows had collided at the place where he had been standing a moment ago. And they had issued a huge sound wave. In fact, it had almost deafened people's ears in an instant. And the ferocious force had made Chu Yang tumble out before he could even stand firm. Chu Yang felt a fatal crisis. He hurriedly leaned his body to one side. However, he felt a burning sensation on his left shoulder. Then, he felt a burst of coldness. An arrow had pierced his shoulder. It had almost pierced through it. Only the arrowhead was left in front of him. Chu Yang rolled a bit. Then he bounced up. His body forcibly transformed into a mass of light. Another 2 whooshing sounds were heard. Chu Yang's legs crossed. 2 arrows shot into his thighs almost at the same time. One on the left, and one on the right. His muscles trembled as he stood upright. Chu Yang coldly snorted. He felt that he couldn't dodge those 2 arrows. But he had crossed his legs. So, those 2 arrows had shot into his muscles. They hadn't hurt his bones. However, Chu Yang still felt a heart-piercing pain when he had received 3 arrow wounds in an instant. 3 people were riding on horses. They were surrounded by the rear army. The bowstrings of their big bows were still buzzing. They looked at each other in amazement. The 3 of them hadn't expected that 3 top-ranked archers in a 1,000,000-man army wouldn't be able to kill King of Hell Chu on the spot. This kind of reaction was too terrifying. All the attacks just now were just for show. The real killing blow was those 3 arrows. These 3 arrows had undoubtedly gathered all of their essence, energy, and spirit. Moreover, they were at such a close distance. So, there was no chance of failure. The 3 of them had felt confident. But they hadn't expected that they would fail at the same time. After shooting those 3 arrows, the 3 of them wouldn't be able to shoot an arrow of C grade in a short time. After all, how could they shoot an arrow with all of their essence, energy, and spirit? Chu Yang rapidly retreated in a spiral shape. His 2 feet fiercely stomped on the ground. Suddenly, the sand on the ground was kicked up by him. It was misty. Whooshing sounds were unceasingly heard. The path that Chu Yang had taken to dodge was full of arrows. However, Chu Yang was finally able to catch his breath. He waved his calamity sword. The arrowheads were cut off at the same time. He let the arrow shaft stay in his body. With a loud whistle, his body soared into the sky. He turned into a ball of light. Then, he fell from the sky like a meteor. He shot high into the sky with a long, flaming tail. What harm is there in slaughtering the entire world? Chu Yang's voice was filled with unspeakable anger. He suddenly swept across the distance of 200 feet, and rushed into the army formation with a sharp howl. It was as if a bomb had exploded. There was a loud bang. The moment he rushed in, more than 2 digits of heads flew into the air. They didn't fall down for a long time. Then, countless severed limbs were thrown into the air like stars. They rose and fell one after another. Blood rolled out like waves. Chu Yang rushed in with his sword like a big ship. He sailed across the surface of the water and advanced courageously. Chapter 348. The only chance to kill Chu Yenji is in that open land. I won't be able to kill him even if I use my life to kill him. So, I can only use the terrain to my advantage. I'll lose this advantage if he enters the crowd. There are a lot of people. There are 10,000 of them. But only a dozen or so people can attack at the same time once the melee begins. How can such a small number of people deal with a king-level expert? Therefore, King of Hell Chu would be like a dragon returning to the sea or a tiger returning to the mountains if he enters the crowd. Signal the flag. Straighten up the formation. Gather the troops and chase him down. Chase him down regardless of the consequences. Wang Tenglong quickly adjusted his mentality. He knew that he still had a chance to kill Chu Yenji. The pursuit of 10,000 people on a single person could drive him to his death. He is very powerful. After all, he is seriously injured. It's impossible for him to kill 10,000 elite soldiers. He will die of exhaustion as long as we continue to consume his energy. Yes. The bodyguard immediately issued the order. Leave only a few people behind to count the casualties. The rest of you should immediately participate in the chase. No mistakes are allowed. Wang Tenglong looked at the messy battlefield. He sighed sadly. But he didn't hesitate. He resolutely and decisively issued the order. Wang Tenglong's heart was filled with hatred. Those bastards of the Golden Horse Riders Department were the main force in hunting down King of Hell Chu. Where the hell did you guys go? We agreed that we would only assist in stopping him. But they sent some ordinary people to stop a king-level expert. This is a complete disgrace. Wan Tinglong was certain that king-level expert Chu Yanji was a valiant king-level expert. Moreover, this king-level expert wasn't a low-level one. Chu Yang rushed out like a hurricane. His golden body had already become a standard blood man. He could see the open land in front of him. Behind him, the sounds of troops being deployed could be heard. Chu Yang knew that this was the time to fight. I'll be safe as long as I can escape this round of pursuit. He leaped into the air and used his final move, Bird Dragon Twisting Pillar, to kick the two cavalrymen off their war horses. Then, he leaped onto his war horse and abruptly pulled on the reins. His legs clamped together, and the sturdy horse let out a long neigh. Then, he twisted his neck and galloped forward like an arrow. Release the arrows! Chu Yang coldly snorted as he heard a stern shout from behind. Then, he leaned on the horse's back and ignored the shout. Swish, 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 Chu Yang fiercely turned around, and brandished his long sword. Bang! 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 The arrows neatly fell on the ground. Chu Yang conveniently grabbed an arrow, and fiercely stabbed it into the horse's buttocks. The strong horse felt the pain and ran even faster. The people behind him shouted and the horses neighed. Then, the sound of iron hooves thundered in an orderly manner. The iron stream quickly formed into a black flood on the road, and chased after Chu Yang at lightning speed. Chu Yang was at the front, and he was riding on a cloud of dust. Behind him, there was a torrential flood no more than 70 or 80 feet away. The entire troop was actually pulled into a galloping formation that was several miles long. Their banners fluttered in the wind, and they let out shrill whistles. In this early summer weather, thousands of people were crazily whipping their horses. A wave of hostility rose into the sky, as if it was going to cover the clear sky. However, the distance between them had finally increased a little. Chu Yang's heart gradually calmed down. Then, he pulled out the 3 sections of the arrow shaft from his body. Enduring the pain, he threw them out. The sword's spirit endured the pain and quickly injected a large amount of medicinal power into his body to heal his wounds. The sound of hooves was rapid as Chu Yang galloped for his life. While he heaved a sigh of relief, he also felt a lingering fear. If it wasn't for the Calamity Sword's ability to devour living beings, he really might not have been able to break through. The troop that he had encountered just now was undoubtedly an elite troop. The extent of their valiance was unimaginable. If he hadn't arrived at the right time and launched his attack when they were setting up camp, it would have been absolutely impossible for him to shake the army. Even so, he had paid a heavy price for it. They had faced the enemy in a panic, but they still had such fighting strength. They had almost left the master of the Calamity Sword here forever. One could well imagine how dreadful this troop was. But I don't know who the commander of this troop is. No matter who the commander is, he isn't an ordinary person. I must be careful if I encounter him on the battlefield in the future. Jing Menghun was still at the bottom of the cliff. He was still searching everywhere. Jing Menghun had found the traces that Chu Yang had left behind when he had gone down the cliff. This had greatly boosted his confidence. King of Hell Chu is here. Therefore, he had searched even more carefully after he had gone down. He had even ordered people to dive into the small pool at the bottom of the cliff to check it out. Some of the flashes were even more noticeable. The bears, wolves, and other animals that had settled down at the bottom of the cliff were very unlucky. They had been forced to flee in all directions. They were in an extremely difficult situation. Everyone felt that victory was in sight. Everyone was in high spirits. They were determined to kill King of Hell Chu at the bottom of the cliff. However, the sound of shouting and killing was heard from afar while everyone was searching for Chu Yang like a raging fire. It wasn't the sound of 1 or 2 people. Instead, it was the sound of thousands of people clamoring at the same time. The sound spread far and wide in this spacious mountain forest. Jing Menghun was startled. He stood up, and strained his ears to listen. He asked, "What's that sound?" The sound could be heard, but it was a mess. The distance was too far. So, it was impossible to hear what was being shouted. "It seems that Wang Tenglong's army is mutinying." A command horse rider frowned and said suspiciously. These words left Jing Menghun speechless. There's only one army in the vicinity. Who else could it be if not him? As for saying that it was a mutiny, Jing Menghun wished that he could slap this guy's head. Wang Tenglong's strict management of his army was well known throughout the world. Jing Menghun wouldn't be surprised if a mutiny could happen in any army. But Wang Tenglong's army would never do so. Moreover, this was his most elite personal army. Since it's not a mutiny, then it must be. Jing Menghun suddenly jumped up. "Not good! King of Hell Chu has rushed out. Let's go quickly!" The command horse rider was stunned. "I said mutiny." But this king-level expert Jing said not a mutiny. And he even said since it's not a mutiny. Then, he said that King of Hell Chu had escaped? This jump in thinking was too big. The command horse rider stared blankly for a while. But he still couldn't figure it out. However, Jing Menghun had already issued an order. So, everyone climbed the opposite cliff, and rushed towards the direction where the sound had come from. However, the battle cries had already faded away by the time they were halfway there. It was already late by the time they arrived at the scene. The entire canyon had turned into a sea of blood. Early summer was the time when all living things were at their most luxuriant. But the flourishing greenery couldn't hide the smell of blood. Less than 500 soldiers were silently and patiently rummaging through the piles of corpses. They were looking for their companions' corpses. They were trying their best to reattach their mutilated limbs to their original bodies. The wind was whistling. Many round heads had been chopped off, and were rolling around in the wind. Their long hair was floating in the air. Jing Menghun felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He rushed forward like an arrow, and grabbed a soldier. He then shouted, "What's going on? Where are the people?" The soldier who had been grabbed by Jing Menghun found it difficult to breathe. He tilted his head, and looked at Jing Menghun with disdain. He then slowly said, "Old people are people." He paused for a moment, and then continued, "And these brothers lying on the ground are also people." Jing Menghun was speechless. He weakly released his grip, and put him down. He then asked, "What's going on?" The soldier looked at him indifferently. His eyes were gradually burning with grief and indignation. He didn't answer. Instead, he asked, "Are you the people of the Golden Horse Riders Department?" Jing Menghun looked at the burning anger in his eyes. He felt somewhat guilty as he replied, "Yes. Hunting down King of Hell Chu is your business." The soldier pursed his lips miserably. It seemed as if he wanted to laugh. But he couldn't. He then said, "We've fought a bloody battle with King of Hell Chu. Countless brothers have died miserably. But you still want to ask, what's going on?" He suddenly straightened his body, and fiercely stretched out his hand. He pointed at Jing Menghun's nose, and shouted with all his strength, "You tell me what's going on." Jing Menghun stared at him in a daze. He was speechless. "Where were you when we were bathed in blood? Where were you when our brothers died at the hands of King of Hell Chu?" The soldier laughed out loud. "The war ended, and you came? You asked us, what's going on?" "Ah?" Jing Menghun heaved a long sigh. He felt speechless. The opposite party was just a small soldier. Jing Menghun could have crushed 10 of them with just one finger. However, this middle-grade king-level expert felt somewhat guilty as he faced the other party's reproach and angry gaze. He heaved a long sigh, and lowered his head. He then asked in a low voice, "How are the casualties? How are the casualties? Can't you see for yourself?" The soldier stretched out his hand and roared. His chest heaved up and down, and his voice became hoarse. His eyes turned red as soon as he heard the word casualties. 130 brothers died in battle. None of them were injured. The soldier's voice became gloomy. His tears finally flowed down and dripped on the ground. "How do you feel about this number?" Jing Menghun could only sigh. Then, he raised his foot, and saluted the corpses on the battlefield. He then said in a loud voice, "Brothers, I'm Jing Menghun. I'm sorry! We were a step too late." They suddenly felt as if their hearts were being fried in oil. 130 had died. But no one was injured. This was enough to explain a lot of things. All the soldiers here knew why they had come. They knew the whole story. Wang Tenglong had never concealed anything when he led the troops, except for some important strategic decisions. Therefore, they felt grief and indignation. Chapter 349. Moreover, it was a war between two countries even if they were only facing one person. However, the Golden Horse Riders Department was supposed to be the main force in the pursuit. But they had arrived late after the war had ended. This was their biggest anger. They wouldn't have sacrificed so many brothers if they had arrived earlier. But the enemy still managed to escape. Therefore, their biggest resentment wasn't King of Helchu. Instead, it was the Golden Horse Riders Department. More than 400 soldiers who were collecting corpses on the battlefield suddenly burst into tears along with Jing Menghun's apology. "Brothers, you died. You sacrificed yourselves. But the other party has also apologized." Even though it was only a gentle apology, Jing Menghun's mood was heavy. He felt ashamed to face these ordinary soldiers. He hurriedly led the experts of the Golden Horse Riders Department to follow the direction of the army. They were chasing after them at full speed. Hundreds of experts of the Golden Horse Riders Department felt that they had lost face. How could they endure being reprimanded by a lowly soldier? But, so many people died because of me. Can I rest with some resentment? We arrived late. So, who can we blame? We had agreed that the enemy would set up a camp to obstruct us. Then, we would fight and capture everything that belonged to us. But Zhu Sha had arrived after the battle. Chu Yang took the lead. He frantically slapped his horse, and swept across the ground like a meteor. However, the army was chasing after him. They were getting closer and closer. There was no fork in the road. There was no intersection. There were only mountains on both sides. There wasn't even a forest. Chu Yang felt that the skin on his inner thighs had been rubbed by the saddle. Wang Tenglong's eyes were firmly locked on the horse in front of him. He was constantly issuing orders. Nearly 1,000 people had dismounted from their horses, and were frantically rushing over on foot. It wasn't that they couldn't support themselves. But this was Wang Tenglong's arrangement. The enemy only had one man and one horse. So, they couldn't run for a long time. Therefore, Wang Tenglong's side had to take care of the horses' stamina. "First, I'll spare 1,000 horses. Then, I'll choose an elite force to chase after the enemy. Then, I'll wait until the 1,000 people in front of me are exhausted. Then, I'll immediately switch to these 1,000 horses. There won't be any delay. Moreover, I'll have twice the stamina of the enemy. This is the method of pursuit. It's common sense that this person wouldn't be lucky if thousands of people chasing after him. Sooner or later, he would be caught." However, Wang Tenglong didn't dare to say that he was confident as he looked at the man and the horse in front of him. Who knows what kind of strange method this resourceful king of Helchu would come up with. Therefore, Wang Tenglong didn't dare to be careless. So, he kept urging them to speed up. He was determined to capture King of Helchu on this straight mountain road. The terrain would give King of Helchu an endless amount of space to display his skills or conceal his tracks. And that would make things difficult for Chu Yang. Chu Yang's whole body was sweating like rain. The pursuers behind him were less than 500 feet away. Although he didn't show it on his face, he couldn't help but feel a little impatient. He knew that if he continued to chase after them like this, he would eventually die at the hands of these 10,000 elites. The horse under him was already sweating profusely, and steam was coming out of its nose. It couldn't hold on for much longer. Chu Yang coldly snorted in his heart. However, he didn't have the slightest intention of giving up. It was nothing more than that, nothing more than that. After turning around, Chu Yang's eyes suddenly lit up. Not far away, the lush greenery was actually so cute. Chu Yang fiercely whipped the horse's back. Then, his body leaned forward slightly. He was ready at any time. Chu Yang's heart was as calm as ice and snow as he faced the hope of getting out of this predicament. Chu Yang turned around, and a group of people shouted at the same time. They saw the dense forest in front of them, and the continuous range of mountains. "Shoot the arrows! Shoot at all costs!" Wan Long hadn't turned around yet. But he knew what had happened when he heard these shouts. He made a prompt decision and gave the order. The speed of this chase was very fast. Shooting arrows would have no effect. The enemy's speed wouldn't decrease at the time the arrows were shot. In fact, he would have already left the shooting range. So, he would have ended up hurting his own people. Moreover, he didn't have a lot of arrows. So, he had no choice but to give up. However, he couldn't care about that at the moment. He didn't have the extravagant hope of killing King of Hell Chu on the spot. Wan Long thought that it would be enough to add a few scars on his body. This would increase the chances of the Golden Horse Riders Department's subsequent pursuit. Thousands of arrows were shot at the same time as the order was issued. Some of the officers even threw their own weapons over. Chu Yang's body sprang up from the horse's back with a long and loud shout. He turned into a fuzzy shadow in the air, and rushed forward like a lightning bolt. His body had barely left the war horse's back when he had suddenly stood up. The powerful recoil had slowed down the horse's speed, and it had suddenly turned into a huge iron hedgehog. It had rushed forward a few feet, and had fallen down with a loud bang. However, Chu Yang's body had already entered the forest like a meteor with the help of this force. The dense trees swayed a few times, and his figure disappeared. Soon after, a series of rumbling sounds could be heard. Dozens of large trees on the outskirts of the dense forest fell down. It was as if Mount Tai was pressing down on them, crashing down on the pursuing cavalry. The men shouted and the horses neighed. The dozens of horses that had been chasing after them didn't have enough time to dodge. The riders on the horses rolled and crawled away horizontally. They rolled on the ground a few times, and finally escaped. However, the war horses weren't so lucky. They were crushed by the trees, and their blood splattered everywhere. These dozens of big trees were so thick that it would take 5 people to wrap their arms around them. They had suddenly fallen down, and had completely blocked the entrance to the forest. People could still go in. However, it was impossible to ride a horse. Chu Yang finally heaved a sigh of relief. Chu Yang had almost reached the point of exhaustion even with the support of the Tribulation Sword. It would have been difficult for me to escape this calamity if this forest hadn't appeared. He forcibly supported his exhausted body, and went all the way to the depths of the forest. He took out a jug of Vitality spring water as he walked. He raised his head, and poured it into his mouth. He gulped down a big jug of water. Then, he felt that the burning sensation in his throat had somewhat subsided. Wan Long waved his hand, and the cavalry stopped one after another. "Send a message to the army on the other side of the mountain. Let them take over the task of capturing King of Hell Chu." Wan Long let out a long sigh. "I've done my best to reach this point. Next would be the Battle of the Jungle. However, if his ordinary soldiers were to enter the jungle, wouldn't they only be slaughtered in this dark primitive jungle? Only an expert would be able to capture King of Hell Chu. General, can we?" Deputy General Sun Fu, whose gasping for breath hadn't calmed down. He was exhausted from the journey. So, he tentatively put forward a suggestion. "How about setting fire to the mountain?" "Setting fire to the mountain?" Wan Long wrinkled his brows. He raised his head, and felt the whistling sound of the wind. It was the southeast wind. He then looked at the unbroken mountain range for thousands of miles. He couldn't help but sigh. There were too many oily trees in this mountain forest. So, a fire dragon would sweep across thousands of miles if it were to catch fire. It might have been early summer. But this lush greenery would have been reduced to ashes. Wan Long hesitated for a moment. Then, he slowly said, Setting fire to hundreds of thousands of acres of mountain forest for one person is too vicious. He sighed again. It was obvious that he was very conflicted in his heart. He spoke again after a long time. This mountain forest stretches across thousands of mountains and rivers. It's 3,000 miles north from here. And it's 1,500 miles south from here. It's all mountain forest. These mountain forests are in the territory of Great Xiao. Wang Tenglong forced a smile. At least 30 million people of Great Xiao rely on these unbroken mountain forests to make a living. This fire would be equivalent to burning 30 million people of Great Xiao to death. It's not that I don't want to. It's just that I can't. Wang Tenglong replied in a somewhat frustrated manner. Sun Fu, who lowered his head in shame. King of Hell Chu may be inside the mountain forest. But our first priority is to put out the fire. We can't set it on fire. Wang Tenglong said. These unbroken mountains have existed for thousands of years. How can we destroy them in our hands? Won't you and I become eternal sinners if that happens? I was too rash. Bifuhu was ashamed of himself. No, you weren't reckless. I was also tempted a moment ago. Wang Tenglong took a deep breath. Setting fire to the mountain would have solved the problem once and for all. But I can't do that. So, I had to convince you to convince myself. He took a deep breath and sighed deeply. He repeated this for a long time. Then, he weakly said, We can't set fire to this mountain forest even if it's an iron cloud, let alone in Great Xiao. This mountain forest is too dense. We are soldiers. We can kill people on the battlefield. But we can't destroy humanity. We can't commit atrocities. Yes. This subordinate will follow the Supreme Commander's instructions. Sun Fu, who was convinced. Wang Tenglong led his men to wait for a while. Jing Menghun and the others finally arrived like a whirlwind. King of Hell Chu has entered this mountain forest? Jing Menghun frowned. Why didn't you pursue him first? Wang Tenglong knitted his brows when he heard these words. Wang Tenglong had a bellyful of anger in his heart. That's your problem, Wang Tenglong replied disdainfully. He meaningfully looked at Jing Menghun and said, King-level expert Jing, the Golden Horse Riders Department must give an explanation for the deaths of my subordinates. He paused for a moment. Then, he slowly said, Even Prime Minister Diwu must give an explanation for this matter. Jing Menghun stared blankly. He could hear that General Wang's heart was on the verge of erupting in anger. He couldn't restrain it. He knew that he was in the wrong. So, he couldn't say anything. Wang Tenglong coldly snorted. Then, he turned over and mounted his horse. His back was as straight as a javelin. His complexion was cold and stiff. He slowly threw out a few words. I, Wang Tenglong, am not someone that a king-level expert like you can question. You don't have the right to question what I do, or whether I pursue or not. Wang Tenglong waved his hand after he had finished speaking. Withdraw! The army followed behind him. They withdrew with a rumbling sound. Every soldier who passed by Jing Menghun and the others looked at them as if they wanted to swallow them alive. Chapter 350. The army slowly withdrew. The last ones to withdraw were the archers who had been intimidating them. They put away their bows and arrows with a click sound. Then, they spurred their horses and left. This matter is our fault. The war is imminent. So, we shouldn't cause trouble for the Prime Minister. Jing Menghun sighed. Then, he vented his anger on King of Hell Chu. He clenched his teeth and ordered. Chase him! 30 people in a group. Divide into 20 groups. Each group will take a spirit contract with them. Use the secret signal of the Golden Horse Riders Department. Search for King of Hell Chu day and night. He is seriously injured. Then, he is surrounded and chased by the army. So, he is exhausted. We can't make any mistakes this time. Jing Menghun and the others cautiously entered the forest. A loud wolf's cry was heard from afar in the forest. Jing Menghun's eyes lit up. Everyone looked at each other. Is it possible that King of Hell Chu didn't have anything to eat? Did he run into a wolf? Does he want to eat the wolf's meat? Well, this possibility is very high. Jing Menghun pondered for a moment. Then, he waved his hand and said, 2 groups, go and take a look. Be careful of the wolf pack. 10 people divided into 2 groups. Chu Yang had already gone deep into the forest. He hadn't gone far when he had entered the forest. He had jumped on a tree and stopped in a lush area. He needed to rest and recover. Secondly, he needed to see the situation. He needed to get his body nimble. He wouldn't have any hope of survival if he were to blindly run away in a panic. This mountain forest was different from the one he had passed through earlier. There were many weeds in that mountain forest. The trees there weren't very dense. There weren't many pine trees. However, pine trees occupied almost half of this mountain forest. There weren't many other kinds of trees. Therefore, he had to extract the juice from the pine trees if he wanted to hide his orchid fragrance in this mountain forest. He had to use that choking smell to hide in the forest. This was a very difficult thing to bear. However, he had no other choice. He could use green to hide in that mountain forest. But he had to use a dark green color in this primitive mountain forest. After tidying himself up, Chu Yang felt that his physical strength had recovered a lot. So, he took out some dry food from the tribulation space and ate it. He filled his stomach and drank a lot of water. Then, he identified the direction and calmly continued his escape. After all, the distance from Great Zhao to here was more than 2,000 li, which was close to 3,000 li. After walking for a few miles, Chu Yang was greeted by 2 green and lustrous eyes which looked like will-o'-the-wisps. This made Chu Yang's heart tighten. Then, he was overjoyed. Wolf. In a forest like this, if there were wolves, there would be a pack of wolves. On the other side was a wild wolf the size of a calf. Its entire body was greenish-black, and it was quite robust. Seeing a stranger, he actually took the initiative to assume an attacking posture, showing no fear at all. Chu Yang took a closer look and saw a row of shriveled mammoths under the wolf's belly. It was actually a female wolf. Chu Yang couldn't help but become more confident. Mother Hui would be more convenient. She didn't waste any more words and directly leaped forward. The she-wolf let out a long howl and pounced on him like lightning. A man and a wolf quickly approached each other and collided with each other. Chu Yang fiercely punched the she-wolf's belly and sent it flying dozens of feet away. It crashed into a big tree and issued a painful whine. Even the sword spirit couldn't understand Chu Yang's behavior. It's too late for you to escape at this critical moment. You can easily bypass this wolf with your agility. Why are you provoking it? Do you have nothing better to do? However, Chu Yang continued to punch the she-wolf. It didn't matter how it tried to dodge or escape. But Chu Yang's heavy fists always hit the most painful places on its body. The she-wolf finally couldn't bear it any longer. It suddenly stopped dodging and placed its long mouth on the ground. Then, it suddenly issued a high-pitched and mournful howl. Chu Yang exposed a smiling expression in his eyes. Then, he suddenly flashed and broke the wolf's hind legs. The wolf's howl became even more tragic as a severe pain assaulted it. Chu Yang also looked up to the sky and screamed at the same time. It seemed as if he was in so much pain that he wished he was dead. Ah! The sword spirit fiercely shivered. You're not injured, my ancestor. Why are you screaming so miserably? Besides, even if you were bitten, you don't have to scream so exaggeratedly, do you? The injuries you suffered earlier were far more serious than this. I didn't even see you groan. Chu Yang continued to scream miserably. His screams were even louder than those of the wolf clan. While screaming happily, he leaped and circled around the forest like a shooting star. A few wild hares and pheasants appeared in his hands. He threw them into the air, and the tribulation's sword was unsheathed. A light ball exploded in the air, and the few small animals that he had just caught were instantly smashed into pieces. With a flick of his sleeves, the pieces scattered in a straight line with a radius of hundreds of feet. The she-wolf was stimulated by the strong smell of blood. It screamed even more miserably and loudly, Chu Yang let it scream and turned a deaf ear to it. He tore off a piece of his clothes and tied it to a tree. Then, he took out a bucket of pine sap from the tribulation space and poured it all on himself. Then, he rushed up the tree with a swoosh. After a few leaps and bounds, he disappeared into the distance. Wolf howls rose one after another in the distance. Whoosh! 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 Giant wolves rushed over from all directions. The entire forest seemed to be filled with waves of wolves as far as the eye could see. The unity of the wolf race was clearly displayed at this moment. However, Chu Yang had already gone in the opposite direction before they had arrived. He had flown away from the sky without any danger. A pleasantly surprised cry was heard from afar. King of Hell Chu is over there. Sword Spirit finally understood Chu Yang's intention. He forced a smile and said, "You're so mean." Chu Ho mischievously laughed and disappeared. How many giant wolves are there in this primeval forest that hasn't been set foot in for thousands of years? Chu Yang didn't know this. He also didn't intend to know. However, he was sure that Jing Minghun and the others would catch up with him later. They would certainly be able to count the number of wolves. The 2 teams of Golden Horse Riders Department had a total of 10 people. They had heard the howls of wolves, and had come to investigate. They had heard the screams of King Chu from afar. Their spirits had been lifted, and they had rushed in the direction of the sound. They had barely approached the place where the howls had come from when they had felt their hair stand on end. The sounds that had echoed from all directions had made their scalps tingle. Rustle, rustle, rustle. It's not good. It's a pack of wolves. One of them was quite perceptive. He immediately shouted. Everyone's scalps tingled. They tiptoed a few steps forward, and looked. My God! My God! Wolves! There are so many wolves! Innumerable wolves! Boo-hoo, boo-hoo! A timid guy sat down on the ground on the spot. He almost cried, Mother, why did you let me intrude into a wolf's den? They saw that the giant wolves were rolling over from all directions. They were converging towards this place. The greenish-black fur of the wolves was constantly moving up and down in the forest. The pack of wolves had become densely packed in a matter of a few breaths. An endless pack of wolves was rushing over from afar. The pack of wolves that had arrived first had smelled the smell of blood. They hadn't thought much about it, and had immediately sounded their horns. Go back quickly. Go back quickly. The revered martial artist who had warned everyone had a deathly pale complexion. His legs were almost playing the pipa. Everyone's cultivation wasn't weak. It wasn't a problem for one person to deal with dozens or hundreds of wolves. But there was absolutely no chance of victory if they were to encounter so many wolves in such a dense forest. There were no less than thousands of wolves gathered in front of them. There were even more that were rushing over. There were even more that were further away. The 10 people hurriedly retreated. But it was too late. There was no need to mention what kind of smell the 10 people would emit in this primitive forest. The smell of these people in this primitive forest, where almost no one had set foot in, would be to the wolf pack's sense of smell. It was like a lighthouse in the dark night, shining with boundless radiance. Moreover, these 2 teams had brought along 2 spirit beasts. The spirit beasts had already let out whines in the face of the smell of so many wolves. This sound had also pointed out the direction of everyone. No one would have thought that the weapon used to hunt down King of Hellchu would become the best target for the wolf pack today. There was no need for any instructions. Pairs of sparkling green eyes looked towards this side. Then, a roar resounded. Hundreds of black shadows leaped into the air, and rushed towards this side. Oh, don't misunderstand. This was an authentic wolf's howl. The greenish-black fur of the wolves stood up. They violently pounced towards the 2 teams like surging waves. Alarmed screams, shouts, sounds of fighting, and the sounds of swords being unsheathed rang out together. The wolf pack became even crazier. More and more wolves swarmed towards this side. The howls of the wolf pack were also heard from another direction. Then, the sounds of fierce fighting, screams, cries for help, and the howls of the wolf pack. It was obvious that the other teams were also being attacked by the wolf pack. Jing Menghun's furious howl was heard. This king-level expert couldn't avoid being discovered by the wolf pack. The smell of blood pervaded the forest at this moment. It soared into the sky, and stimulated the ferocity of the wolf pack. Countless wolves were still as vigorous as the wind in the dense forest. They rushed over in batches and groups to participate in the battle. We must wipe out these hateful humans who have intruded into our territory. This is the world of wolves. Oh, King of Hell Chu! You despicable villain! You're a vicious bastard! You! Jing Menghun quickly chopped down the wolf pack that was rushing towards him. He was so angry that his belly was about to burst open. He was so angry that his vision turned black. It seemed as if his heart was going to explode. This bastard has attracted tens of thousands of wolves in order to escape for his life. Jing Menghun saw that the experts of the Golden Horse Riders Department that he had painstakingly gathered were drowned in the wolf pack. They were fighting a desperate battle against a pack of wild beasts. He felt like vomiting blood. It wasn't easy to gather so many people. But it wasn't to kill wolves. King of Hell Chu, you won't die a good death! Jing Menghun was so angry that he felt dizzy. He cursed out loud. Then, he fell into an extremely arduous battle to kill the wolves. He could leave if he wanted to, but the remaining people would face tens of thousands of hungry disciples if he left, and they would be finished. Chapter 351. The 10 Golden Horse Riders are trying their best to hunt down King of Hell Chu. Ha ha ha! Tai Longqing happily said. It is said that King of Hell Chu stole Di Wuqing Ro's treasure house. Di Wuqing Ro's anger soared to the sky. So, he ordered the Golden Horse Riders Department to mobilize. He didn't hesitate to cooperate with the various government forces to capture King of Hell Chu and bring him to justice. Then, he laughed heartily and said cheerfully, King of Hell Chu is sitting here calmly. Di Wuqing Ro must have been blinded by lard. What else could it be? Tai Butian's body trembled as soon as these words came out. His complexion changed. Wu Qianqian clenched her fists tightly. However, the Thunder Generals and the advisors burst into laughter. It seemed as if they had heard a big joke. They were overjoyed. It could be said that Niao Qianqian's progress under Chu Yang's influence was obvious to all during this period of time. Whether it was military affairs, politics, or schemes, Chu Yang stuffed everything into Niao Qianqian's head, and then taught her personally. Then, Chu Yang went to Great Xiao as a shopkeeper after it had started to take shape. Therefore, Wu Qianqian had continued to take care of all the matters. Niao Qianqian had also carried out Chu Yang's policy. She had integrated her delicate and feminine nature into her work. Therefore, her work had become more seamless. Not only had Butian Pavilion admired this minister more and more. Even Tai Butian believed that Wu Qianqian wasn't inferior to Chu Yang. Tai Butian had been in charge of the overall situation ever since they had arrived in the southern border. Tai Longqing had been immersed in the army. Wu Qianqian had led Butian Pavilion to eliminate spies. Her ideas were ingenious. Her calculations were precise. Her actions were ruthless and clean. Even an experienced soldier like Tai Longqing was amazed. This also meant that Chu Siwang's current status was like the sun and the sky. He didn't have the slightest doubt about King of Hell Chu's identity. Now that he had heard that Di Wuqing Ro had mobilized the entire country to capture King of Hell Chu, Tai Longqing almost burst into laughter. Tai Longqing believed that Di Wuqing Ro must have been ruthlessly played by someone since the real King of Hell Chu was by his side. This was great news for him. At this moment, Tai Longqing's mood couldn't be described with the word delight or schadenfreude. That was Di Wuqing Ro. Who could deceive him like this? Minister Chu, what do you think about this matter? Tai Longqing asked Wu Qianqian with great interest. There was even a playful smile on his face that was overjoyed. It's hard to say, Wu Qianqian replied absent-mindedly. Her heart was full of worry for Chu Yang. During this period of time, whenever he was free, Tai Longqing would catch him and chat with him. Furthermore, He had threatened him countless times to make him fulfill his promise. God knows what kind of promise Chu Yang had made to him at that time. Therefore, Wu Qianqian had been humming and humming in a perfunctory manner. However, the more perfunctory Chu Yang was, the more excited Tai Longqing became. Later on, Tai Longqing tried to guide Chu Yang in a roundabout way. Others might not know Chu Yang, but how could Niao Qianqian not know? Chu Yang had always been the type of person who wouldn't withdraw until he saw an opportunity. So, Niao Qianqian wouldn't have believed that Chu Yang had promised to give Tai Longqing a divine weapon at that time. Therefore, she flatly denied it. Tai Longqing became angry. However, King of Hell Chu wasn't someone to be trifled with. Wu Qianqian's strength in this regard had left Tai Longqing dumbfounded. However, he was helpless. He had been so angry that he had flipped the table many times. However, Wu Qianqian didn't yield an inch. During this period of time, the two of them had become enemies. However, Wu Qianqian's strength had imperceptibly established her absolute authority among the army's generals. This was Tai Longqing. He was the number one person in the entire Iron Cloud nation. He was second only to the emperor. Ordinary military officers wouldn't dare to argue with him. Some of them would even pee in their pants if he glared at them. Wu Kuan-yun was one of the top 10 generals of the continent. However, he had been caught and beaten by Tai Longqing a few days ago. So, there was no need to mention the others. However, this King of Hell Chu had covered his face. He was mysterious. However, he was able to confront Tai Longqing on the spot without falling into a disadvantageous position. In fact, his imposing manner was enough to make Tai Longqing flip the table in anger. However, he was able to remain calm and composed. How could an ordinary person do such a thing? Why is it hard to say? Tai Longqing asked tirelessly. Because you haven't clearly explained the situation of this matter. For example, Diwu Qingro has been chasing after King of Hell Chu. Has he been caught? Where is he now? How many people have been dispatched by the Golden Horse Riders Department? What about the losses of the Golden Horse Riders Department? What about King of Hell Chu's actions? Wu Qianqian snorted and said, You haven't said these things. How would I know how to judge? Tai Butian's fervent gaze also looked over. He chimed in. Yes, second uncle, you haven't clearly explained the situation. Isn't this making things difficult for us? Tai Longqing suddenly felt that something was amiss. Isn't this matter funny? Why aren't these two people laughing at all? He coughed twice, and began to speak. Tai Butian and Wu Qianqian straightened their bodies as he narrated. They stared at him intently, and began to calculate something in their hearts. Tai Butian's complexion turned deathly pale when he said that this King of Hell Chu had been fatally injured. And he was fleeing towards Iron Cloud. Moreover, the Golden Horse Riders Department was chasing after him relentlessly. Niao Qianqian's body also began to tremble slightly. Her small hands were tightly clenched under her black robe. Her blue veins were exposed. Tai Butian's complexion seemed to be a special mask. It wouldn't change under normal circumstances. However, he had exposed such a deathly pale complexion this time. It could be seen that his heart was fluctuating greatly. Tai Butian paced back and forth in the tent that night. He felt that his thoughts were in a mess. It was difficult for him to control himself. A guard shout came from outside the door. Who is it? Ah, it's the minister. Wu Qianqian walked in. She was dressed in a black robe. What does your majesty intend to do about this matter? Wu Qianqian asked as soon as she entered. She had made up her mind that she wouldn't take the initiative to enter Tai Butian's tent. This was because she had always been on guard against Tai Butian. On one hand, she was afraid that His Majesty Tai Butian would have improper thoughts about her. On the other hand, she had a vague feeling that this His Majesty would snatch away something very precious from her. This was a strange feeling. Wu Qianqian herself didn't know what was going on. She didn't know what the precious thing that Tai Butian was going to snatch away was either. However, she still felt uncomfortable in her heart. Therefore, she wouldn't take the initiative to look for Tai Butian. Tai Butian would usually look for her at the heaven-pouncing pavilion. What else can I do? Tai Butian snorted coldly and said. Huh! What do you mean? Wu Qianqian's heart tightened. She angrily said. Don't tell me that you're going to do nothing? Tai Butian, you're really scheming. How can you be so vicious? Chu Yang has done so many things for you. He has almost turned the situation of the entire world around for you. Now that he's in danger, you're actually going to turn a blind eye to it? In her fury, Niao Qianqian had forgotten that the person in front of her was the ruler of a nation. She questioned her directly and with a deep sense of disappointment. Nonsense! Who says that I'm going to give up? Tai Butian was flustered and exasperated. Wretched girl, what are you thinking about all day long? Then you... Wu Qianqian was stunned. Why did Tai Butian's voice sound so sharp? It was completely different from his usual voice. Moreover, this was the first time she had seen such an exasperated look. I'm thinking of a suitable way to bring Minister Chu back. Tai Butian sighed deeply. Her right hand clenched into a fist and punched her left palm fiercely. There was an indescribable anxiety that she couldn't control even though she was trying her best. Bring him back. Yes, we must act immediately to bring him back. Wu Qianqian's eyes lit up. How can it be so easy? Tai Butian sighed. From here to the prefectures is 13,000 miles. And this is the border of Iron Cloud. It can be said that 13,000 miles is within the boundaries of the prefectures. At present, almost 1 million soldiers of Great Zhao are hoarded here. We can't get through. The only possibility is that Chu Yang will use his own strength to break through here. Then, we'll go and provide support for the last part of the journey. The more Tai Butian spoke, the more powerless she became. 13,000 miles. How long would it take for Chu Yang to break through by himself? How long would it take for him to play hide-and-seek with Great Zhao's entire national apparatus with his own strength? Moreover, he had a clear goal and gave the enemy a way to block him. How could he get through? Even a middle-grade king-level expert would have died if he had tried to rush all the way here. Even an emperor-level expert wouldn't necessarily be able to survive this. Wu Qianqian's delicate body swayed twice. She said in despair, disappointment, and hatred. You mean that we won't do anything? Wait for him? Do you think that's possible? Tai Butian! You're so heartless! Stop! Tai Butian's voice was sharp as he berated her sternly. Then, he softened. Wu Qianqian snorted heavily and sat down. She didn't notice that she was sitting on Tai Butian's seat. However, she didn't stand up. It was clear that she wasn't going to leave if Tai Butian didn't give her an explanation. Tai Butian was burning with anxiety. How could he pay attention to such a trivial matter? He paced back and forth. Then, he finally said slowly, Minister Chu won't go through a town if he wants to return. He won't have any hope if he goes through a town. The only way is through the forest. And it's the shortest way. Forest? Wu Qianqian's spirit was lifted. The shortest way to go through the forest is from the Qilong Mountain. Then, you'll enter the 1,000-layer forest. You'll have to cross 3,000 miles through the dense forest. You'll have to pass through the Jiagu Pass, the Sun City, and the Gold Star Pass. Then, you'll have to cross the forest and cross the heavy water swamp. Then, you'll have to cross the Great Ba Mountain. You'll have to cross the Great Ba Mountain and enter the continuous forest. Then, you'll have to cross the White Snow Mountain and the Ice Peak. Then, you'll have to cross the Jade Snow Mountain Range to enter the continuous mountain range of Beyond the Heaven Sect. We'll be able to provide support once we get there. We won't be able to provide support until we get there. Tai Butian carefully considered. Then, he slowly said these words. He pointed out the only feasible way for Chu Yang to escape. Chapter 352. However, Tai Butian's calculations left Wu Qianqian in despair. This is not something that a single person can do. Wu Qianqian almost jumped up. She was furious. Even an iron man would melt alive if he were to walk on this road. What's more, Chu Yang is made of flesh and blood. What's more, he is seriously injured. What's more, the martial arts experts of the Golden Horse Riders Department are hunting him down. What are you doing if you aren't watching with folded arms? A man made of iron can't do it, but it doesn't mean that Chu Yang can't, Tai Butian said coldly. Tai Butian felt as if there was a fire burning in his heart. The anxiety in his heart was no less than Wu Qianqian's. He even wanted to grab Wu Qianqian's clothes and shout, "I am also worried about him. I don't want anything to happen to him. Because. However, he couldn't say it. He couldn't shout it either. He could only hide it in his heart. Then I will go to beyond the heaven sect and wait. Wu Qianqian made a prompt decision and stood up. You! What's the use of you going? Our 200,000 strong army won't be there. You won't be of much use. Moreover, you won't be able to command the army to cooperate with you. Tai Butian snorted and said, I need to go. You! Miao Qianqian's eyes widened in surprise. The ruler of a nation was leaving the front line when the war was about to break out. Don't forget that there is also a path there. There is also a battlefield there. Di Wuqingrou's 500,000 strong army is heading there. Tai Butian said heavily. Second uncle has been managing this place for 20 years. With him around, it is impregnable. However, there is only a geographical advantage there. Someone must be in charge. If I separate from uncle and propose to guard there, he won't refuse. Because he thinks that place is much safer than here. Wu Qianqian was silent. The reason why that place was Di Wuqingrou's main target was because the terrain there was high and steep. It was easy to defend and difficult to attack. It could be said that one man could hold back 10,000 men. Millions of troops could fight at the same time on this side of the battlefield. However, only less than 10,000 people could fight at the same time on that side. Moreover, these 10,000 people were the total number of people on both sides. Iron Cloud City was located at the steepest and most crucial part of the mountain. It stood majestically. Di Wuqingrou had mobilized 500,000 soldiers for this attack. It could be said that this was an unprecedented move. Well, I'll go too. Wu Qianqian suddenly became spirited and said, Let's go together. No, you can't go. Tai Butian's eyes flashed strangely. She said, The pressure on royal uncle's side is too great. Moreover, after I leave, he won't have anyone to consult with and can only make decisions on his own. But facing Di Wuqingrou like this is too risky. Therefore, you have to stay. Even if you can only provide an advisory role, it will be the greatest help. Wu Qianqian frowned and stubbornly said, No. I have to go. I won't be at ease until I see him return safely. You must stay here. Tai Butian refused to budge. For some reason, Tai Butian just didn't want Miao Qianqian to go this time. He clearly knew that to Miao Qianqian, once Chu Yang returned, this kind of blissful reunion after a long separation would be enough for her to remember for the rest of her life. However, Tai Butian didn't want Wu Qianqian to go. She couldn't say anything. The two argued for a long time and finally came to an agreement. If Chu Yang returned, Wu Qianqian had to know immediately. Moreover, Wu Qianqian had to rush to meet Chu Yang as soon as she got the news. However, if Chu Yang didn't return within a month, then Miao Qianqian would go even if the sky fell down. Both of them were filled with anxiety. Tai Butian felt that he had won this round. Wu Qianqian didn't know the secret behind this. So, she bit her lips and reluctantly made this agreement with Tai Butian. Miao Qianqian still felt very wronged. She still wanted to go, but she couldn't persist. She felt that Tai Butian's decision was a little too rash and willful. Moreover, Tai Butian might be in danger if he went there. However, she strongly hoped that Tai Butian would go there quickly. Because Tai Butian could only mobilize the army there and defeat the invading enemies in one fell swoop. Only then could he command the army to go south and support Chu Yang. Just as Tai Butian had said, the army wouldn't listen to her if she went there. She could only be anxious and helpless. This was the main reason why Niao Qianqian had compromised. The next day, Tai Butian and Tai Longqing discussed for a while, and proposed to go there. Tai Longqing was having a headache about Tai Butian's safety. So, he slapped his thigh as soon as he heard this proposal. It was incomparably satisfying. After all, he would be facing an army of more than 4 million soldiers. Once the war broke out, the army would be in turmoil and chaos. His Majesty would be done for if anything happened to him. However, no one could guarantee that he wouldn't die in such a situation. Tai Longqing had been racking his brains to think of a way to send His Majesty to a safer place. Now that Tai Butian had proposed it, it was exactly what he had been hoping for. He immediately mobilized 100,000 elite soldiers under the leadership of Wu Kuan-yin. They were accompanied by 40,000 imperial guards and experts. On the surface, they looked like ordinary soldiers, but secretly escorted Tai Butian. Of course, the imperial flag of the main camp was still standing tall and fluttering in the wind. It was showing everyone that the emperor was still here. Tai Longqing finally felt relieved. He felt a lot more relaxed. Tai Butian was there. First, it was a lot safer. Second, both sides had powerful commanders who could coordinate with each other. Third, it was a great buffer. After all, this was the decisive battlefield. In case of defeat, Iron Cloud would not perish as long as Tai Butian was still alive. He could then concentrate on fighting his old enemy, Di Wuqingro. He could go all out and fight to the death without any misgivings. That night, Tai Butian led everyone and left the main camp. Niao Qianqian and the people of Butian Pavilion and Beyond the Heavens sect stayed behind. Tai Butian wanted to take Wu Yunliang and the others. After all, they were the local tyrants and were familiar with the terrain. However, Wu Qianqian rejected this idea without hesitation. Then, she let Qingyang take all the experts of Butian Pavilion who were martial great masters and above to follow Tai Butian. The people of Beyond the Heavens sect were very familiar with the terrain. Moreover, their martial arts were very high. But there were too many unsafe factors. For example, Second Marshal Uncle Li Jinsong. For example, how could Wu Qianqian let them follow Tai Butian? Naturally, Wu Yunliang could not go. If he went, the rest of the people would make wild guesses. Guessing back and forth, they might even leak the information. Therefore, Wu Qianqian rejected all of them. It was better to nip the problem in the bud. Tai Longqing's advice to Tai Butian was, after reaching the other side, do your best to defend. Don't ask for any merits, just do not make any mistakes. Your safety is the most important thing. Tai Butian agreed wholeheartedly, and then left. Even if the army could march, it would still take 4 days to reach the other side. However, under Tai Butian's urging, the 200,000 men and horses moved as fast as lightning. They reached the other side in 2.5 days. Then 2.5 days later. Reporting to Supreme Commander, there are changes in the Eastern Front. The scout reported to Tai Longqing. He was so tired that his whole body was cramping. This rapid march had almost made the scout's body fall apart. But he remembered Tai Longqing's previous orders. He persevered and finally rushed back. Ah? There are changes in the Eastern Front? Tai Longqing, who was gathering the generals to discuss the military situation, was shocked. Tai Butian had just arrived. How could there be changes? He didn't have time to think. So he hurriedly asked, "What happened?" Great General Wu Kuan-yun immediately took over the military power after he arrived. The former Commander-in-Chief General Li Fanlan became a muddle-headed general under Great General Wu Kuan-yun. Then, the 200,000 soldiers were reorganized. The scout reported. Wu Kuan-yun's actions are very fast. Tai Longqing felt relieved. He was very gratified. He stroked Hu Dale and said, "This is not a change. Even if there is a change, it should be a change." He was very gratified. He thought, Wu Kuan-yun is worthy of being one of the top 10 generals. He's usually rough and straightforward. But he won't be careless at a critical moment. Look at this matter. He's very efficient. I'm relieved that His Majesty is with him. Yes, but there's more to it. The scout wanted to say something but stopped. He secretly raised his head to look at the Supreme Commander's face. What else is there? Tai Longqing was in a very good mood. Great General Wu Kuan-yun immediately reorganized the troops after he took over the military power. He combined the three forces into one. Then, in less than 2 hours, the First Jin Army broke out of the slanting valley. They opened a path through the mountains and built bridges. The scout clenched his teeth and said, "Ah, what?" Tai Longqing's hand shook. A strand of his beard was pulled off. It fluttered in his hand. But he didn't feel any pain. He suddenly turned his head. He used a lot of strength to turn his head. He almost twisted his neck. He stared at the scout. His eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Inside the tent, all the generals widened their eyes and opened their mouths wide. Maintaining the posture of Gang Kai, all of them froze in place. Wu Kuan-yun. How can he be so bold? Isn't this a disgraceful way of doing things? The war hasn't started yet. Moreover, the entire country is in a bad situation. Great General Wu has just become the main general of a branch. But he has already launched an attack? Crap, what's going on? We're not dreaming, are we? Several staff officers pinched the muscles on their thighs. They grimaced in pain. They couldn't believe it. Great General Wu Kuan-yun has issued an order. He's going to lead 300,000 men and horses. They're going to march straight into the valley. They're going to meet Great Zhao's White Tiger General, Bai Chang Tian's 500,000 men and horses head-on. The distance between the two sides was less than 200 kilometers by the time this subordinate left. The scout was sweating profusely. Tai Longqing was dumbstruck. His eyes turned white. He almost fainted. Chapter 353. After a long time, the calm and composed general of the army suddenly jumped up in rage. He kicked the table in front of him, and roared in anger. "Wu Kuan-yun! You intolerable pig! I'll pull out your tendons! I'll peel off your skin! I'll drink your blood! I'll chop your body into pieces! I'll kill your whole family! I'll exterminate your whole family!" The scouts were only 200 kilometers away from the enemy when they arrived. 2.5 days had passed by now. The battle had already begun. Tai Longqing was fuming with anger. He was stamping with rage. He was almost crazy. He smashed everything he could see in the general's tent. He was gasping for breath. He was fuming with anger. Tai Longqing had already made up his mind. I won't care about beheading a general in front of a battle if I see Wu Kuan-yun again. I'll chop that pig's head off his neck as a sacrifice to the flag. Wu Kuan-yun, this old man will kill you according to military law! Tai Longqing roared. His beard was like a halberd. The generals kept quiet out of fear. They didn't know that Great General Wu Kuan-yun was also depressed to the point of death. He would have killed himself if he knew Tai Longqing's current state. What can I do? I'm a great general. That's true. But I'm only a great general in name. His Majesty has already seized the real power. His Majesty makes all the decisions arbitrarily. What does it have to do with me? I've been kowtowing to persuade him. My forehead is swollen. Does anyone know this? Your Majesty, you can't advance rashly, Wu Kuan-yun said in a tearful voice. I've already made up my mind. There's no need to say more. Tai Butian's face was as cold as ice. His gaze was as sharp as a sword. He was obstinate. Wu Kuan-yun repeatedly tried to dissuade him. But Tai Butian ruthlessly rebuked him. Eventually, he demoted the great general in private. This nominal great general had already become a soldier in the army. Tai Butian also had his own considerations. It would have been too hasty and thoughtless to dispatch troops at this time. It would have been disadvantageous to the overall situation. Furthermore, it was foolish of them to abandon their natural stronghold and take the initiative to attack. Once the army was defeated, they would be pursued by the enemy. It was very likely that the army would be routed like a landslide, and the enemy would kill their way into the heart of Iron Cloud. However, Tai Batian had other considerations. Relying on natural defenses was a bad idea. At most, he could guarantee that he would not lose, but he would never be able to obtain victory. This battle was a matter of life and death for the entire Iron Cloud. How could they be conservative? Everyone thought that this place would be defended to the death, but I wanted to take the initiative to attack. This was what it meant to be caught off guard. Bai Chang Tian's army had come from afar, but they hadn't arrived at their destination yet. In fact, they didn't even have the time to set up camp. Although it was risky, the current situation had reached a point where they had no choice but to take the risk. Moreover, there was also a very important person returning from this route, Minister Chu. So, Minister Chu would have fallen into a dead end if he had allowed Bai Chang Tian to set up a camp and block his way back. After all, he would have been surrounded by enemies in front of him, and would have been pursued from behind. Baidu Tieba world-defying heavens, no matter what, he would not allow it. No matter how one looked at it, they had no choice but to send out their troops. Moreover, the sooner the better. Wu Kuangyun, you only need to fight. Go and seize victory, Tai Batian coldly said. I don't care what a supreme commander like you thinks. But you only need to obey orders when the time comes. Anyone who disobeys orders will be beheaded. Wu Kuangyun wanted to cry, but had no tears. He was an old soldier. He had been on the battlefield for half of his life. How could he not know that he had to take the enemy by surprise at this time? He had a 10% chance of winning. Bai Chang Tian was a famous general of his generation. But he would have never thought that the natural defenses would send out their troops to fight. After all, Great Xiao and Iron Cloud had been fighting for hundreds of years. Great Xiao had always tried every means to attack Iron Cloud, while Iron Cloud had only defended. This had never changed. This had become a fixed trend in the minds of all the generals. Perhaps they would be able to defeat the famous White Tiger general in this battle. Immortal, even if there was only a 1% chance of defeat, they couldn't let Tai Batian take the risk. Iron Cloud would have been completely routed if something went wrong. The White Tiger general, Bai Chang Tian, was also very puzzled. The enemy had a natural stronghold along the way. They didn't need a lot of people. In fact, they needed less than 1,000 people to defend this place. Even the attack of 100,000 troops would have been of no use. Why did the Prime Minister change his itinerary this time? And why did he arrange 500,000 troops here? This shouldn't have been the case. Whether it's from a strategic point of view or from the overall situation, such a decision shouldn't have been made. In Bai Chang Tian's mind, only 200,000 troops would have been needed to pin down the enemy. Then, they would have taken over this place after the victory of the main battle had been achieved. Well, it's hopeless to attack head-on. Is it because of that King of Hell Chu? Humph! King of Hell Chu is called King of Hell. But he's only one man. It's impossible for a man to run for thousands of miles by himself. Moreover, he must have been chased for thousands of miles to reach this place. Wouldn't that make him an immortal? General, the heaven-splitting mountain pass is about 300 miles ahead. Brothers, we've been trekking for a long time. Men and horses are tired. Shouldn't we take a rest? The deputy general beside him said. Yes. We're almost there. What's there to rest for? How can a soldier not have the least bit of tenacity? Are they still my soldiers? Bai Chang Tian reprimanded with a cold face. Then, should we continue with the rapid march? The deputy general's face twitched. Bai Chang Tian slowly nodded. He then said in a routine manner, Inform the brothers to speed up the march. We can set up camp as long as we reach the designated place. And we won't have to worry about anything from then on. We can take turns to rest. In all fairness, Bai Chang Tian felt very uncomfortable in his heart. His biggest contribution as a soldier was to attack a city, seize territory, and expand his territory. The decisive battle had arrived at this time. And he had to hide here. He couldn't get any credit for this battle. This made him feel very aggrieved. Bai Chang Tian almost thought that someone had given him a bad impression in front of the Prime Minister. However, it was a fool's dream to think that he could get any credit here. Attacking the heaven-splitting mountain pass was an arduous and thankless task. The enemy's geographical advantage was too abnormal. It was like a knife-cut cliff. Moreover, it was cut inwards. The entire mountain pass was 1,000 feet above the ground. It was almost vertical. One couldn't see anything below the mountain pass even if they raised their heads. In fact, it looked like a concave cave. Since ancient times, there had only been a narrow and winding path to reach the top. Moreover, it was so steep that it made people want to curse. Even the strongest physique would lose its strength by the time they climbed up. The enemy only needed 100 or so soldiers to defend the mountain pass. And they would be able to kill all the soldiers who could rush up without getting injured. Fight. How do we fight? Big. This is a disgrace. The war is about to begin, but I have to come here for a vacation, long. Therefore, Bai Chang Tian had been strict with the army along the way. However, it was only out of habit. He had always been wise and prudent. But he was much more relaxed at this moment. After turning a bend in the mountain, the road ahead finally became a little more spacious. Bai Chang Tian's spirit was lifted. He was about to give the order to speed up when he suddenly wrinkled his brows. He felt that something was wrong. He couldn't help but frown and ponder. Then, he felt that the ground under his feet was slightly trembling. Countless birds in the distance were startled. They squawked and flew in all directions. Countless small animals in the forest were frightened and fled in all directions. Smoke and dust rose to the sky in front of them and filled the entire sky. Enemy attack. The sharp bugle horn of the vanguard army sounded. It was accompanied by an extremely frightened scream. Bai Chang Tian's body tensed up. He immediately responded. Army, stop! Get ready to meet the enemy! However, his scalp went numb when he looked at his surroundings. There are mountain walls on both sides. My troops are walking on this narrow mountain road. My men and horses are exhausted. There's no way to retreat. We can only fight among ourselves. We can only rush forward. However, the army didn't have any fighting spirit at the moment. Moreover, the enemy had clearly recharged their strength. So, how can we fight this battle? The army in the front stopped when the order was given. However, the army of 500,000 soldiers was marching at the same time. So, the army in the front had stopped. However, the army in the rear hadn't received the order yet. Many soldiers had been rushing for several days. So, they had been sleeping while walking. They had been relying on the support of the formation to stay standing. The soldiers in the front had been pushed forward by the soldiers in the rear. So, the soldiers in the front had been pushed forward. They had slowly squeezed into a group in the middle of the formation. Their chests were pressed against each other's backs in an incomparably intimate manner. Curses were heard from the soldiers who didn't understand what was going on. The entire army had been thrown into chaos by the time they had stopped. Only the sounds of people cursing in different dialects could be heard. Are you blind? You stepped on your grandfather. Fuck! Whose grandfather are you? I'm your grandfather. Puff! You dared to hit me. You dared to hit me. Brothers, attack. Kill this turtle. Fuck your mother. Fuck! Fuck! Bai Chang Tian looked at the general beside him in a panic. His complexion had turned deathly pale. He had been in the army for 30 years. However, this was the first time he had felt powerless. Everything had been going smoothly for the past several hundred years. So, he and everyone else knew that the heaven-splitting mountain pass's defenders wouldn't take the initiative to attack. Moreover, they hadn't seen even half of the enemy's scouts along the way. So, they knew that the enemy had chosen to stick to their defense. Their vigilance had been getting lower and lower. However, they hadn't expected that the enemy would strike a fatal blow at such a critical time. The sound of hoofbeats from the opposite side was getting closer and closer. The enemy didn't slow down. Instead, they increased their speed. Their shouts and battle cries reverberated in the air. The enemy clearly wanted to rely on their sharpness and thunderous fury to defeat their troops in one fell swoop. A loud roar was heard. Then, a military flag suddenly fluttered in the wind and rolled out. The wind whistled and blew against the flag. A golden dragon was soaring in the sky above the flag. And a white cloud was crazily expanding above the golden dragon. You're tuning into the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.